Hey there, night owls. Tonight we're exploring a family that basically hacked the entire system of medieval power. No royal blood, no ancestral castles. Just a bunch of village doctors from the Tuscan countryside who somehow ended up with popes, dukes and queens of France sitting at their dinner table. The Medici didn't just climb the social ladder, they rebuilt it with themselves at the top. Picture this. One family, at the same moment in history, controlling the Vatican, ruling Florence, and whispering into the ear of French kings. That's not a fantasy novel. That's the 15th century. And the wildest part, their name literally means doctors, because great-great-grandpa was probably fixing broken bones in some muddy village, from bandaging peasants to bankrolling empires. Now that's a glow-up. So before we dive in, smash that like button if you're into stories of ambition, genius, and just a little bit of ruthlessness. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from tonight? What time is it in your corner of the world? Now dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's uncover how a family of nobodies rewrote the rules of European power. Ready? Let's go. Let's start with a name, Medici. Say it out loud, Medici. It rolls off the tongue with a certain elegance, doesn't it? The kind of name you'd expect to find etched into marble above palace doorways, or whispered in the corridors of Vatican power. But here's the thing. That refined, aristocratic-sounding name actually translates to something far less glamorous. Medici means doctors, or more accurately, medical practitioners. We're talking about the medieval equivalent of the family who ran the local clinic, except their clinic was probably a wooden shack in a muddy village, and their medical degree came from watching Grandpa apply leeches to feverish farmers. The family traces its origins to a tiny settlement called Cafaggiolo, nestled in the Mugello Valley north of Florence. If you visit today, you'll find rolling Tuscan hills, cypress trees, and that golden light that makes everything look like a Renaissance painting. Back in the 12th and 13th centuries, though, it was simply countryside, rural, agricultural. The kind of place where your biggest ambition might be owning an extra goat, or perhaps marrying into a family with a slightly larger vegeting patch. Not exactly the breeding ground for future popes and queens, you might think. And yet, somehow, from this unremarkable patch of Italian soil emerged a dynasty that would reshape European civilization. The earliest Medici we can trace with any certainty were indeed involved in medicine, or at least something resembling it. Medieval medicine, it should be noted, was a fairly loose term. If you could mix herbs without poisoning too many patients, set a broken bone without causing gangrene, or confidently declare that someone's humours were out of balance, you could call yourself a healer. The competition wasn't exactly fierce. The Medici family crest, featuring 6 red balls or palais on a gold shield, is thought by some historians to represent pills or cupping glasses, the tools of their ancestral trade. Others suggest the balls represent coins, which would certainly be appropriate given where the family ended up. A few creative souls have even proposed they represent dents in a shield from some heroic battle, though evidence for any Medici military glory in those early centuries is, shall we say, thin on the ground. Whatever those mysterious red balls originally symbolized, they would eventually become one of the most recognized emblems in European history. You can still spot them today all over Florence, on buildings and churches carved into stone and painted onto ceilings. They're the medieval equivalent of a corporate logo, and the Medici made sure to slap their brand on everything they touched. Which, as we'll discover, turned out to be quite a lot. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to those humble beginnings, because understanding where the Medici came from makes their eventual rise all the more remarkable. In the early medieval period, European society was rigidly stratified. You had your nobility, the people born into castles and titles, and then you had everyone else. Social mobility wasn't really a concept. If your father was a peasant farmer, you would be a peasant farmer. If your grandfather was a village healer, well, start practicing your bedside manner. The idea that a family could leap from rural obscurity to continental dominance within a few generations simply wasn't how things worked. Except, apparently nobody told the Medici. The first Medici to make any real noise in Florentine records appears in the early 13th century, and already we see hints of the family's future trajectory. They weren't content to stay in Cafaggiolo mixing poultices. Instead, they migrated to Florence itself, a city that was rapidly becoming one of the most dynamic urban centres in Europe. This was a crucial decision. Florence in the 1200s was transforming from a modest Tuscan town into an economic powerhouse. The wool trade was booming. Banking was emerging as a legitimate profession rather than a slightly disreputable sideline. And unlike the feudal territories elsewhere in Europe, Florence operated as a republic, theoretically at least, where wealth could translate into political influence in ways impossible under traditional monarchies. The Medici saw opportunity, and they grabbed it with both hands. Throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, various family members appear in Florence's records as minor guildsmen, small-scale merchants, and middling political figures. Nothing spectacular, no great fortunes, no legendary deeds. They were climbing, but slowly, one rung at a time on a ladder that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. Several of them actually got into trouble with the law. There are records of Medici being fined or exiled for various offences, including at least one case of murder. Charming ancestors, these. Not exactly the refined patrons of art and learning their descendants would become famous for. But perhaps that's the point. The Medici didn't start as philosopher kings. They started as scrappy, ambitious, occasionally violent social climbers in a city that rewarded exactly those qualities. To understand the Medici rise, you have to understand Florence itself. This city was different. While most of medieval Europe operated under feudal systems where power flowed from kings through nobles to peasants in a neat hierarchical pyramid, Florence had developed something far messier and far more interesting. Technically, it was a republic. In practice, it was a complicated tangle of competing guilds, wealthy families, and shifting political factions that would make modern parliamentary politics look straightforward. The city was governed by a rotating system of councils and elected officials, with positions changing hands every few months to prevent any single family from accumulating too much power. A lovely theory, that. As we'll see, the Medici found ways around it. Florence's economy ran on wool and cloth, but increasingly it ran on something even more portable and powerful: money itself. The city had established the gold florin in 1252, and this coin quickly became the standard currency for international trade across Europe. When a merchant in London wanted to buy goods from Venice, he often paid in Florentine florins. When the Pope needed to move funds from Germany to Rome, Florentine bankers handled the transaction. Florence had positioned itself as the financial capital of the medieval world, and this created opportunities for anyone clever enough to grasp them. The banking business in medieval Italy was not for the faint of heart. Let's be clear about what banking meant in this era. It wasn't a respectable profession in the way we might think of it today. The Catholic Church officially condemned usury, the lending of money at interest, as a mortal sin. Charging interest was considered a form of theft, stealing from borrowers by exploiting their need. Dante, Florence's most famous literary son, placed usurers in the seventh circle of hell in his Divine Comedy, right alongside blasphemers and sodomites. Not exactly an endorsement for your career choice. And yet, medieval commerce absolutely required credit and lending. Ships needed financing before they could sail. Merchants needed capital to buy inventory. Kings and popes needed loans to fund wars and building projects. Someone had to provide these services, theological objections notwithstanding. The solution, naturally, was creative accounting. Medieval bankers developed an impressive array of techniques to technically not charge interest while actually charging interest. They would lend money in one currency and demand repayment in another, pocketing the favourable exchange rate. They would provide loans at no stated interest but include gifts or fees that looked remarkably like interest payments. They would purchase goods at one price and sell them back at a higher price, with the difference functioning as interest. It was financial engineering before the term existed, and the Italians, particularly the Florentines, became masters of it. The word bank itself comes from the Italian banco, the bench or table, where money changers conducted their business. When a banker failed, his bench would be broken, bancarotta, giving us the word bankrupt. Florentine bankers broke quite a few benches over the centuries, but they also built fortunes that would have made kings envious. This is the world the Medici entered as they transitioned from village healers to urban merchants. They weren't the first Florentine banking family, and for much of the 13th and 14th centuries, they weren't even close to the biggest. That honour belonged to families like the Bardi and Peruzzi, whose operations dwarfed anything the Medici could muster. The Bardi and Peruzzi banks were genuinely international enterprises, with branches across Europe and lending portfolios that included the kings of England and France. In the early 14th century, they were among the largest financial institutions in the world, and then, in the 1340s, they collapsed. spectacularly. The fall of the Bardi and Peruzzi banks offers a cautionary tale about the dangers of lending to monarchs, a lesson the Medici would learn well. King Edward III of England had borrowed enormous sums from both banks to finance his wars against France, the conflict that would eventually become the 100 Years' War. When Edward decided he couldn't or wouldn't repay these loans, the banks were left holding worthless promises. Combined with other economic disasters, including the arrival of the Black Death in 1348, which killed perhaps a third of Europe's population and utterly disrupted trade, the Florentine banking sector experienced a catastrophic crash. The Bardi and Peruzzi were ruined. Other major banks followed them into oblivion. The financial landscape of Florence was devastated. But here's the thing about devastation. It clears the field for new players. The Medici, still relatively minor in this period, survived where the giants fell. They hadn't lent their fortune to an unreliable English king because, frankly, they didn't have a fortune large enough to lend. Their modest scale protected them. And as Florence's economy slowly recovered from plague and financial collapse, the Medici were positioned to fill the vacuum left by their fallen competitors. Sometimes the best business strategy is simply being too small to fail spectacularly while your rivals destroy themselves. The man who truly launched the Medici into the stratosphere of wealth and influence was Giovanni de' Medici, born in 1360. If you're looking for the founder of the Medici dynasty as we know it, the patriarch whose decisions would echo through centuries, Giovanni is your man. He didn't wear a crown or command armies, but he built something more durable, a financial empire that would fund the family's ambitions for generations. Giovanni understood something fundamental about power. It wasn't about making noise. It was about making money, quietly, steadily, and in quantities that made you indispensable to the people who did make noise. Giovanni had grown up in modest circumstances by Medici standards. The family had money, but they weren't among Florence's elite. He learned the banking trade as a young man, working in Rome where he gained experience handling the most lucrative client any medieval banker could hope for, the Catholic Church. The papacy was a massive financial operation. It collected taxes and fees from across Christendom, funded diplomatic missions and military campaigns, maintained an enormous bureaucracy, and commissioned enough art and architecture to keep generations of artists employed. Managing papal finances required sophisticated banking services, and Giovanni de' Medici positioned himself to provide them. By 1397, Giovanni had established his own bank in Florence, with a branch in Rome that specialized in papal accounts. This wasn't just smart business, it was strategic genius. The relationship with the papacy provided steady income, prestigious connections, and a degree of protection that secular banking couldn't offer. When you're handling God's money, or at least the Pope's money, people think twice before trying to cheat you. Giovanni cultivated these connections carefully, never pushing too hard, always providing excellent service. He understood that in banking, reputation was everything. One failed payment, one scandal, one moment of dishonesty, and decades of work could evaporate. He ran his operation with meticulous care. The Medici Bank under Giovanni pioneered several innovations that would become standard practice in modern finance. They developed an extensive network of correspondent banks and branches across Europe: Rome, Venice, Geneva, Bruges, London, and others. Each branch operated somewhat independently, with local managers who understood local conditions but all reported back to Florence and followed Medici standards. This distributed structure allowed the bank to handle transactions across vast distances with remarkable efficiency. A merchant in Bruges could deposit money with the Medici branch there and receive credit in Florence without any actual gold having to make the dangerous journey across the Alps. Letters of credit and bills of exchange, documents that represented money rather than being money, flowed through the Medici network, greasing the wheels of international trade. Giovanni also diversified the family's interests. Banking was profitable, but it was also risky. One bad loan, one defaulting king, and you could lose everything. So the Medici invested in other ventures: the wool trade, silk manufacturing, and eventually alum mining. Alum was a crucial industrial chemical used in dyeing cloth, and the Medici secured a near monopoly on the European alum trade through their papal connections. This diversification meant the family wasn't dependent on any single income stream. If one business suffered, others could compensate. It was portfolio management before anyone had invented that term, and it worked brilliantly. But Giovanni's greatest skill may have been political. not financial. He understood that in Florence, overt displays of wealth and ambition attracted envy and opposition. The city had a strong republican tradition and deep suspicion of anyone who seemed to be reaching for too much power. Previous wealthy families had been brought down by accusations of tyranny, their assets confiscated and their members exiled or killed. Giovanni avoided this fate by maintaining a carefully cultivated image of modesty and civic virtue. He dressed simply, not in rags, but nothing ostentatious. He lived in a respectable but not palatial home. He paid his taxes fully and on time, unlike many wealthy Florentines who used every trick to minimize their obligations. He supported public projects and charitable causes without demanding personal credit. When Giovanni did engage in politics, he positioned himself as a champion of the common people against the established oligarchy. This was partly genuine. Giovanni did support tax reforms that shifted some burden from the poor to the wealthy, and partly calculated. By aligning with the popular faction, he built a broad base of support that protected him from elite rivals who might otherwise have moved against a rising newcomer. The masses loved him because he seemed to be on their side. And the masses, in Florence's republican system, had enough political weight to matter. Giovanni was playing a long game, and every move was deliberate. He married well, too. His wife, Piccarda Bueri, came from a respectable Florentine family, solidifying the Medici's position within the city's merchant elite. Together they had 2 sons who survived to adulthood, Cosimo and Lorenzo. Giovanni invested heavily in their education, ensuring they were prepared to take over the family enterprise. This wasn't just business training, though there was plenty of that, but a broader humanistic education that included classical languages, literature, philosophy, and art. Giovanni may have built the fortune, but he wanted his sons to be more than mere bankers. He was laying the groundwork for the Medici to become something unprecedented. By the time of Giovanni de' Bicci's death in 1429, the Medici Bank was the largest and most profitable financial institution in Italy, possibly in all of Europe. Giovanni left behind an estate worth well over 100,000 florins, an almost inconceivable fortune by the standards of the time. To put this in perspective, a skilled craftsman in Florence might earn 30 to 50 florins per year. A comfortable middle-class existence required perhaps 100 florins annually. Giovanni's wealth was equivalent to thousands of years of ordinary wages. And crucially, this wealth came with political influence, papal connections, and a network of alliances stretching across the continent. But Giovanni being Giovanni, he didn't die with a chest-thumping declaration of dynasty. His deathbed advice to his sons was characteristically subtle. Avoid ostentation, stay out of public disputes, and never seek political office unless it's thrust upon you. Let others take the glory and the risks of formal power. You keep the money and the real influence. This wasn't false modesty. It was a strategic blueprint for how to rule without ruling, how to control a republic while letting it believe it was free. Cosimo, Giovanni's elder son and heir, would take this advice and perfect it into an art form. Before we move to Cosimo's era, though, let's pause to appreciate what Giovanni de' Bicci had accomplished. In a single lifetime, he had transformed the Medici from middling merchants into the preeminent banking family in Europe. He had secured the papal account, the most prestigious and lucrative client in medieval finance. He had built an international network of branches and correspondents that could move money across continents. He had diversified into manufacturing and trade, and he had done all this while maintaining a reputation for modesty and civic virtue that protected him from the envy and opposition that had destroyed other ambitious families. It was a masterclass in how to accumulate power, quietly, carefully, with strategic patience and an understanding that perception matters as much as reality. The timing of Giovanni's success was not coincidental. He had built his empire during a unique moment in European history when finance was becoming increasingly important, but before the established powers had fully grasped how to control it. Kings and popes needed money desperately, for wars, for buildings, for the constant expenses of maintaining power, but they didn't yet understand money well enough to manage it themselves. They needed bankers, and the Medici were the best bankers in the business. Giovanni had made the family indispensable, and indispensability is the foundation of lasting power. The papal connection deserves special attention here, because it would remain central to Medici strategy for the next 2 centuries. The Catholic Church in the 15th century was not just a religious institution, it was one of the largest economic entities on earth. It collected revenues from every corner of Christendom: tithes, fees for ecclesiastical services, indulgences, taxes on church properties, and countless other streams of income. These funds had to be collected locally and transferred to Rome, which required sophisticated banking services. The church also spent lavishly on St. Peter's Basilica and other construction projects, on maintaining the papal court, on diplomatic missions, and occasionally military ventures. Every florin coming in and going out created opportunities for bankers who handled the transactions. Giovanni de' Medici had captured a significant share of this business, and his successors would expand it further. But the relationship wasn't purely financial. By handling papal money, the Medici gained access to papal favour. They could influence ecclesiastical appointments, secure privileges for their trading ventures, and protect themselves from competitors. When you're the Pope's banker, other banks think twice about challenging you. The Church's spiritual authority might have been declining in this period. The Avignon papacy and the Great Schism had damaged its prestige, but its economic and political power remained formidable. The Medici understood this perfectly. They attached themselves to the institution like a remora to a shark, feeding on the scraps of papal commerce while benefiting from the protection of that great spiritual bulk. This relationship would eventually produce something even more valuable than banking fees, actual Medici popes, but we're getting ahead of ourselves again. For now, let's appreciate the foundation Giovanni built: money, networks, papal favour, and a reputation for humble civic virtue. These were the tools his sons would use to achieve something unprecedented in European history: the transformation of a banking family into de facto royalty. Now let's talk about how banking actually worked in the Medici era, because it's crucial to understanding their power. Modern people often think of medieval banking as a primitive version of what we have today. Same basic concept, just less sophisticated. This fundamentally misunderstands the situation. Medieval banking was different not just in scale, but in kind. It operated under constraints and opportunities that have no modern equivalent, and the Medici's genius lay in navigating these unique conditions better than anyone else. The central challenge, as we've mentioned, was the Church's prohibition on usury. You could not openly charge interest on loans. This seems like it would make banking impossible. Why lend money if you can't make a profit? But medieval bankers found numerous workarounds. The most common was the Bill of Exchange, a document that essentially disguised interest as currency exchange fees. Here's how it worked. You would lend money in florins, but the borrower would agree to repay you in London in English pounds. The exchange rate built into this transaction would be favourable to you, the lender, effectively giving you an interest payment without ever calling it interest. The fiction was that you were merely exchanging currencies, a service for which fees were perfectly acceptable. Everyone involved knew it was really a loan at interest, but the documentation said otherwise, and that was enough to satisfy the Church's requirements. The Medici Bank perfected this system. With branches across Europe, they could genuinely offer currency exchange services. Their international network made them uniquely qualified to handle cross-border transactions. But they also used this network to facilitate lending on a massive scale while maintaining the fiction of mere exchange. Their double-entry bookkeeping, a technique still relatively new in the 15th century, allowed them to track these complex transactions with precision. Every credit had a corresponding debit. Every asset was matched by a liability. The books balanced, and the Medici could tell at a glance exactly where they stood financially. This might seem obvious today, but many of their competitors were still keeping accounts in more haphazard ways that made it easy to lose track of loans, miss payments, or fail to notice when a branch was in trouble. The Medici also pioneered a relatively decentralized management structure that allowed them to operate effectively across vast distances. Each branch was led by a local manager who had significant autonomy to make decisions on the ground. These managers were often invested in the branch through a system that resembled modern partnerships. They shared in the profits, which gave them incentive to run the branch well, but they also shared in the losses, which gave them reason to be prudent. The central office in Florence set overall policy, provided capital and maintained quality control, but day-to-day operations were handled locally by people who understood local conditions. This structure allowed the Medici to operate simultaneously in Rome, Venice, Geneva, Bruges, London, and other cities without requiring Giovanni or his sons to be personally present everywhere. Communication in this era was, by modern standards, painfully slow. A letter from Florence to London might take weeks. News of major events could be weeks old by the time it reached distant branches. The Medici dealt with this reality by developing standardized procedures and building trust with their branch managers. If you hired the right people, trained them properly, and gave them appropriate incentives, you could rely on them to make good decisions even when you couldn't supervise them directly. This sounds like basic management theory, and it is, but in the 15th century it was cutting-edge organizational innovation. The bank's clientele ranged from small merchants needing modest letters of credit to the most powerful figures in Europe. At one end, the Medici provided basic banking services that kept commerce flowing: deposits, withdrawals, currency exchange, and short-term credit for trading ventures. At the other end, they negotiated enormous loans to kings and popes, transactions that required not just financial resources but diplomatic skill, since collecting from a sovereign who decided not to pay was essentially impossible. The Medici were cautious about royal loans, having learned from the Bardi and Peruzzi disaster, but they couldn't avoid them entirely. Refusing a king's request was dangerous in its own way. The trick was to manage the risk, insist on collateral when possible, keep the amounts reasonable, and never let any single loan become large enough to threaten the whole enterprise. The papal business remained the jewel in the Medici crown throughout the 15th century. The family held the position of papal bankers for much of this period, handling the enormous sums that flowed into and out of the Vatican. This relationship brought steady income. The fees on papal transactions alone made the Medici rich, but more importantly it brought influence. The Medici could affect who got church appointments, which projects received funding, and how papal policy affected Florence and their business interests. They cultivated successive popes carefully, providing excellent service and never pushing too hard, always maintaining the relationship for the long term rather than squeezing short-term profits. Giovanni di Bicci's son Cosimo expanded the papal connection dramatically. He financed the Council of Florence in 1439, one of the most important diplomatic events of the century, which attempted to heal the schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches. Though the council ultimately failed in its religious objective, it succeeded magnificently in raising Florence's and the Medici's international prestige. Hosting Byzantine emperors and Orthodox patriarchs alongside Catholic cardinals and the Pope demonstrated that Florence had become a major player on the world stage, and everyone knew the Medici had paid for it. The council also brought Greek scholars to Florence, sparking a revival of interest in Plato and classical philosophy that would become central to Renaissance humanism. Cosimo founded the Platonic Academy to continue this work, investing in intellectual enterprises that paid dividends in cultural prestige for centuries. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of Medici banking. The family understood that money was just the beginning. Wealth could be converted into other forms of power, political influence, cultural prestige, religious favour, and those forms of power could, in turn, generate more wealth. They created a virtuous cycle where banking profits funded artistic patronage, which enhanced their reputation, which attracted more business, which produced more profits. The chapel in their parish church featured frescoes by Benozzo Gozzoli depicting the Medici themselves in the guise of the three wise men worshipping Christ, a rather bold statement of their self-image, but one they could afford to make. Who was going to criticise the family that paid for everything? The Medici weren't the first bankers to become patrons of the arts, but they did it on a scale and with a strategic sophistication that set them apart. Every building they funded, every artist they supported, every book they commissioned served multiple purposes simultaneously. It demonstrated their wealth, certainly, but it also demonstrated their taste, their learning, their piety. It associated the family name with beauty and excellence in a way that mere wealth alone could not achieve. When Cosimo de' Medici commissioned Brunelleschi to design the sacristy of San Lorenzo, or supported Donatello's revolutionary bronze sculptures, he wasn't just buying decorations, he was investing in the Medici brand. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because the scale of Medici wealth can be hard to grasp in the abstract. At its peak in the mid-15th century, the Medici Bank was probably earning somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 florins per year in profits, a massive sum that dwarfed most contemporary fortunes. The total capital of the bank approached 100,000 florins, spread across multiple branches and investments. To maintain perspective, the entire annual budget of the Republic of Florence was around 100,000 to 200,000 florins. The Medici, a single family, commanded resources comparable to the government of one of Europe's wealthiest city-states. This wasn't just wealth. It was economic power on a scale that blurred the line between private and public, between commerce and government, and yet the Medici never acted like they had all this money. That was perhaps their most brilliant move. Giovanni de' Medici had established the family tradition of understatement, and Cosimo perfected it. He dressed modestly. He lived in a fine house, but not a palace, at least not until later in his life, and even then the Medici palace was designed to impress through elegance rather than overwhelming opulence. He walked through the streets of Florence, greeting neighbours and appearing accessible. He loaned money to fellow citizens who needed it, creating a vast network of people who owed him favours. He funded public projects, churches, libraries, hospitals, that benefited the city and associated the Medici name with civic generosity rather than private greed. This careful management of image allowed the Medici to accumulate power without triggering the Republic's defences against would-be tyrants. Florence had strong traditions against any single family dominating the state. Citizens were expected to participate in governance through rotation of offices, and there were actual laws against overt political dynasties. The Medici navigated these constraints by controlling the city informally rather than formally. They didn't need to hold office themselves when they could ensure that their allies always held office. They didn't need to change the laws when they could simply make sure the laws were administered by people loyal to them. It was shadow government, power without the crown, rule without the title, and it worked for generations. The banking model the Medici developed would influence European finance for centuries. Their methods, international branch networks, bills of exchange, double-entry bookkeeping, diversified investments, careful risk management, became standard practice as banking spread across the continent. When other families and institutions built their own financial empires, they often consciously imitated the Medici approach. The Fuggers of Augsburg, who would become the dominant bankers of 16th century Europe, studied and adapted Medici techniques. The English merchant companies that would later build Britain's commercial empire used organisational structures recognisably similar to what Giovanni de' Medici had pioneered. But the Medici Bank itself would not last forever. In fact, it would decline significantly even before the dynasty reached its peak political power. The late 15th century saw a series of crises that eroded the bank's profitability. Bad loans, political turmoil, and poor management by later generations who lacked Giovanni and Cosimo's careful touch. Lorenzo the Magnificent, perhaps the most famous Medici, was actually a terrible banker who nearly ran the family business into the ground while focused on politics and art. The London branch collapsed. The Bruges branch suffered enormous losses. By the time Lorenzo died in 1492, the Medici Bank was a shadow of its former self. This is one of the great ironies of Medici history. Their political and cultural achievements peaked just as their banking empire crumbled. The family had used finance to build something larger than finance, a political dynasty, a cultural legacy, a name that would be remembered for centuries. Once those foundations were in place, the bank itself became almost dispensable. The Medici would continue to rule Florence, produce popes, and marry into royal families long after their banking supremacy had faded. Money had been the means, not the end. Giovanni de' Medici had built a fortune, but more importantly, he had built a platform from which his descendants could reach for power of an entirely different kind. The transformation from bankers to rulers was not immediate or inevitable. It required generations of careful positioning, strategic marriages, and shrewd political manoeuvring. But the seed was planted in Giovanni de' Medici's counting house, in those columns of figures tracking florins and debits and credits flowing across Europe. Every transaction was a relationship. Every loan created an obligation. Every successful deal enhanced the Medici reputation. The bank was a machine for generating not just profits but connections, favours and influence. The raw materials of power in a world where formal titles meant less than practical ability to shape events. When we look at the Medici story, it's tempting to see it as a fairy tale of rags to riches, of humble healers becoming mighty lords. But the reality is more interesting than that. The Medici weren't lucky peasants who stumbled into fortune. They were strategic operators who understood their environment and exploited its opportunities systematically over generations. Giovanni de' Medici didn't just get rich. He got rich in ways that positioned his family for greatness. He chose the right city, entered the right business, cultivated the right clients, and built the right reputation. And then he passed all of this, the wealth, the networks, the strategies, the ambition, to sons he had carefully prepared to take it further. The Medici invented nothing. Double-entry bookkeeping existed before them. Bills of exchange were used by other banks. Papal finance was handled by various families over the centuries. What the Medici did was combine these elements more effectively than anyone else and sustain their advantage across multiple generations. They were the Apple or Amazon of medieval banking, not necessarily the first movers, but the ones who figured out how to do it better and scale it up. And like those modern tech giants, their success wasn't just about having a good product. It was about building an ecosystem that reinforced their position and made it progressively harder for competitors to catch up. By 1429, when Giovanni di Bicci died and Cosimo inherited the bank, the Medici were no longer merely wealthy merchants. They were something new under the sun, a private family with public power, a commercial dynasty that rivaled traditional nobility, bankers who would become princes. The transition from the first to the second wasn't complete. Cosimo would spend his life expanding and consolidating, but the trajectory was clear. The Medici had invented a new path to power, one that didn't require royal birth or military conquest. All it required was money, properly deployed, across enough time with enough patience and skill. As the night grows darker and we prepare to explore Cosimo's extraordinary career, consider what the Medici had discovered in the emerging world of the Renaissance, where trade was becoming more important than land and money was becoming more important than swords. A new kind of power was possible. Old aristocracies would spend centuries learning to adapt to this reality. The Medici grasped it from the beginning. They were the original disruptors, challenging ancient hierarchies with the revolutionary force of capital. And they were just getting started. The foundation of every great fortune contains a mixture of luck, timing, and ruthless intelligence. Giovanni di Bicci had all three, but his greatest gift to his descendants was something less tangible, a strategic vision that could be inherited and refined. He didn't just leave Cosimo money and business connections. He left a playbook for how to turn commercial success into dynastic power, a playbook the Medici would follow for the next 3 centuries, as they collected papal tiaras, ducal crowns, and royal marriages with the same methodical determination their ancestor had once collected deposits and bills of exchange. The Medici Bank was the original engine of this ascent, the machine that converted labour and risk into wealth and influence. Understanding how it worked, its techniques, its clients, its careful balance of aggression and caution is essential to understanding everything that came after. The artworks, the palaces, the popes, the queens, all of these grew from roots that Giovanni di Bicci planted in the Florentine financial soil. From medicine to money to monuments, the Medici trajectory was underway, and Europe would never be quite the same. Cosimo de' Medici inherited his father's fortune in 1429, and with it, a rather delicate problem. He was now the richest man in Florence, possibly the richest man in Italy, and everyone knew it. In a city that prided itself on republican equality, where citizens were supposed to rotate through government offices and no single family was meant to dominate, being conspicuously wealthy was a bit like wearing a target on your back. Previous rich families had learned this the hard way. The Florentine Republic had a long tradition of cutting down anyone who grew too tall, and Cosimo's family tree was looking distinctly timber-worthy. The obvious solution might seem to be seizing power directly. Declare yourself duke, build an army, crush your enemies, and rule openly. This was, after all, what ambitious families did in most of Italy. The Visconti had done it in Milan. The Gonzaga in Mantua. Various strongmen and warlords had carved out personal domains across the peninsula, trading republican pretense for straightforward despotism. But Cosimo was smarter than that. He understood something fundamental about Florentine politics that escaped many of his contemporaries. The city's republican institutions weren't just window dressing. They were deeply embedded in civic identity, and anyone who openly destroyed them would face resistance that no amount of money could buy off. Florentines might tolerate being manipulated, but they wouldn't tolerate being obviously subjugated. The trick was to rule without appearing to rule. What Cosimo invented, or perhaps perfected since elements of it existed before him, was a system of informal control that historians have called everything from crypto-signoria to shadow sovereignty to, less charitably, sophisticated corruption. The Republican machinery continued to function exactly as it always had. Elections were held, councils met, laws were debated and passed. Citizens rotated through offices according to traditional schedules. On paper, Florence remained a free republic governed by its people. In practice, every lever of that machinery had a Medici finger on it. The key to understanding how this worked lies in Florence's peculiar electoral system. The city didn't hold elections in the modern sense, with campaigns and voting and all that messy democratic theatre. Instead, it used a system of sortition, selection by lot, combined with careful vetting of who was eligible for the lottery in the first place. Names of eligible citizens were placed in leather bags called borse, and when offices needed to be filled, names were drawn at random. This was supposed to prevent any faction from controlling the government, since you couldn't predict who would be chosen. The randomness was the point. But here's the thing about randomness. It's only random if the pool is genuinely neutral. If you can control who gets into the bags in the first place, you've essentially rigged the lottery without technically cheating. Cosimo and his allies did exactly this. Through a combination of legal manipulation, strategic alliances, and occasional intimidation, they ensured that the borse were filled predominantly with names friendly to Medici interests. When a name was drawn for the Signoria, Florence's executive council, or any other important office, it was overwhelmingly likely to be someone who owed the Medici money, favoured their policies, or was related to them by blood or marriage. The lottery remained random. The outcomes did not. This system required constant maintenance. Cosimo couldn't just rig the bags once and forget about them. Political alliances shifted, old friends died, new rivals emerged, and the eligible population changed over time. He had to continually cultivate relationships, distribute favours, and monitor the complex web of Florentine factions to ensure his coalition held together. This was not the work of a tyrant sitting on a throne issuing decrees. It was the work of a politician, a networker, a deal-maker, someone who understood that power in a republic flows from relationships, not commands. Cosimo's approach to governance has been compared to everything from a mafia don to a modern political boss, and there's truth in both comparisons, though neither quite captures the subtlety of his operation. He didn't rule through fear, primarily. He ruled through obligation. The Medici Bank had lent money to half of Florence's elite families at one point or another, and those debts translated into political loyalty. When Cosimo needed a vote or a favour, he didn't have to threaten anyone. He just had to remind them gently of what they owed, not just financially, but socially. In a culture built on honour and reciprocity, these obligations were binding in ways that modern people sometimes struggle to appreciate. He also controlled information in ways that gave him enormous advantages. The Medici Bank's international network meant that Cosimo often knew about major events before anyone else in Florence. When a king died, a war started, or a trade route was disrupted, Medici correspondents sent word immediately. This information advantage was commercially valuable. You could make smart investments if you knew things first, but it was also politically powerful. Cosimo could position himself ahead of events, prepare responses before crises became public, and appear almost prophetically wise in his judgments. His rivals were always playing catch-up, responding to situations Cosimo had already anticipated and planned for. The physical arrangement of power in Florence reflected Cosimo's informal dominance. He eventually built the Palazzo Medici, a grand residence that was nevertheless designed to avoid the appearance of a fortress or a princely palace. It had no towers, no battlements, no obvious defensive features. The facade was rusticated stone on the ground floor, impressive but not threatening, transitioning to smoother stone above. The message was clear. This is the home of a wealthy citizen, not a strong man. Inside, of course, the palazzo was magnificently appointed, with art collections and a private chapel that rivaled anything in the city. But the exterior maintained the Republican fiction. Visitors entering the palazzo passed through a courtyard adorned with classical inscriptions and ancient sculptures, a calculated display of cultivated taste that subtly communicated the owner's superiority. The architecture itself was a political statement, designed by Michelangelo to project exactly the right image: prosperous but not threatening, distinguished but not tyrannical. Interestingly, Cosimo had originally commissioned Brunelleschi to design the palazzo, but rejected the plans as too grandiose. The architect, whose ego was as massive as his talent, was reportedly furious. He smashed his wooden model in rage. But Cosimo's instinct was correct. A palace that looked like a royal residence would have aroused exactly the kind of Republican suspicion he was trying to avoid. Better to have something slightly less impressive that wouldn't attract envy and opposition. This anecdote reveals how carefully Cosimo thought about appearances. Every architectural choice, every decorative decision, every public gesture was calculated for its political effect. He was playing a game that never stopped, where the pieces were buildings and paintings as much as votes and alliances. Government officials would come to the Palazzo Medici to consult with Cosimo before making decisions. This wasn't required by law. Cosimo held no official position that entitled him to such consultations, but it became customary. Why make a decision without checking with the man who probably knew more about the situation than you did, and who would certainly be affected by the outcome? This informal advisory role gave Cosimo enormous influence without any formal authority. He could shape policy by offering suggestions that everyone understood were more like instructions, all while maintaining the pretense that elected officials were making their own independent choices. Not everyone accepted this arrangement gracefully. Cosimo faced serious opposition throughout his career, most dramatically in 1433 when his enemies succeeded in having him arrested and exiled from Florence. The Albizzi family, who had long competed with the Medici for influence, managed to convince enough of the government that Cosimo was a threat to republican liberty, which, to be fair, he absolutely was, just not in the way they meant. Cosimo was imprisoned in the Palazzo Vecchio, specifically in a small room in the bell tower called the Alberghetto, and faced the very real possibility of execution. His enemies had finally caught him, and they intended to make sure he never threatened them again. The imprisonment was genuinely dangerous. The Alberghetto was essentially a holding cell for prisoners whose fate was being decided. Many previous occupants had proceeded directly to execution. Cosimo, no fool, was acutely aware that being alive today guaranteed nothing about tomorrow. He reportedly refused to eat the food provided, fearing poison, until a sympathetic jailer shared his own meals with him. The terror of those days left a lasting impression. Cosimo never forgot how close he'd come to destruction, and it made him more careful and more ruthless in the decades that followed. What happened next reveals just how deeply embedded Medici influence had become. Cosimo's allies immediately went to work, calling in favours, applying pressure, and reminding various officials of what they owed the Medici bank. According to some accounts, substantial bribes changed hands. The Gonfaloniere of Justice, the chief executive of Florence at the time, was allegedly paid 1,000 florins to ensure Cosimo's life was spared. Whether true or embellished, this detail captures the essential Medici method. When in trouble, apply money to the problem until it goes away. The political tide began to turn almost as soon as Cosimo was locked up. Within days, his death sentence had been commuted to exile, a significant victory since exile was survivable and reversible in ways that decapitation was not. Cosimo was sent to Padua and then Venice, where he spent a year living in comfortable circumstances, maintaining his business networks and waiting for the inevitable. In Venice, Cosimo was treated more as a visiting dignitary than a disgraced exile. He stayed in the monastery of San Giorgio Maggiore, attended by servants, receiving visitors, and continuing to manage his banking empire through correspondence. The Venetians, who appreciated both his money and his usefulness as a counterweight to other Italian powers, made sure he was comfortable. Cosimo even managed to do some business deals during his exile, maintaining the bank's operations and keeping his network intact. For a man supposedly in disgrace, he was doing remarkably well. The inevitable happened in 1434. Cosimo's enemies had won a battle but not the war. Without Medici money lubricating the machinery of Florentine politics, things began to seize up. Debts went uncalled, favours went ungranted, and the coalition that had expelled Cosimo started to fracture. Meanwhile, the Medici faction organised, and when new elections produced a government sympathetic to their cause, Cosimo was invited back to Florence in triumph. His enemies were now exiled in turn, their property confiscated, their families disgraced. It was a complete reversal, accomplished not through violence or military force, but through the patient application of money and influence. Cosimo returned to the city he had never officially ruled, and resumed not ruling it, now more securely than ever. The experience of exile taught Cosimo valuable lessons. He became even more careful about maintaining republican appearances while tightening his actual control. He also became more systematic about eliminating potential opposition, before it could organise. The Medici faction created new mechanisms to ensure their dominance, including constitutional changes that concentrated power in smaller councils more easily controlled and more aggressive vetting of who could hold office. These measures were justified as reforms to improve governmental efficiency, which they arguably were. They also happened to make Medici dominance nearly unassailable, which was not coincidental. Cosimo's style of leadership was famously understated. He dressed simply, avoided ostentation, and maintained a manner that suggested he was just another citizen, albeit a particularly successful one. When foreign dignitaries visited Florence, they were often surprised to find the city's most powerful figure living without guards, walking the streets, and accessible to ordinary people who had business with him. This accessibility was partly genuine. Cosimo does seem to have enjoyed talking with artists, scholars, and regular citizens, and partly calculated. A tyrant hides behind walls and soldiers. A citizen moves freely among his peers. Cosimo was determined to be seen as the latter, regardless of how much the former might have been true. His political philosophy, to the extent he articulated one, emphasized stability and continuity over dramatic change. He didn't try to revolutionize Florence or impose radical new systems. He worked within existing institutions, bending them to his purposes rather than breaking them. This conservatism had practical benefits. It minimized resistance, maintained legitimacy, and allowed for gradual adjustments rather than sudden shocks. It also reflected Cosimo's personality. He was not a visionary dreaming of utopia. He was a banker, accustomed to calculating risks and returns, preferring steady compounding to spectacular gambles. The shadow government Cosimo built lasted, with interruptions, for over 60 years, an extraordinary achievement in the volatile world of Italian Renaissance politics. His son Piero, though less capable, maintained the system for 5 years after Cosimo's death. His grandson Lorenzo, known to history as the Magnificent, elevated Medici influence to new heights, while paradoxically weakening its foundations. The system finally collapsed in 1494, when Lorenzo's son Piero fumbled a diplomatic crisis and the family was expelled from Florence. But even that exile proved temporary. The Medici returned in 1512, and this time they eventually dropped the pretense entirely, becoming official Dukes of Florence and later Grand Dukes of Tuscany. The shadow government had served its purpose. It had established the Medici as Florence's natural rulers so thoroughly that when they finally claimed formal titles, it seemed like merely acknowledging reality. Understanding Cosimo's system helps explain one of the great puzzles of Medici history: how a family of bankers came to be remembered as princes. They weren't princes, not during Cosimo's lifetime. They were private citizens who happened to control almost everything that mattered. But the effect was similar enough that contemporaries sometimes struggled to describe what exactly the Medici were. Were they tyrants? Not exactly. The Republic still functioned. Were they citizens? Technically yes, but citizens don't usually have foreign ambassadors seeking their audiences or determine papal policy through their personal relationships. The Medici had created something new, a form of power that existed in the spaces between traditional categories, drawing legitimacy from republican forms while exercising authority that was effectively monarchical. This model would influence political thinking for centuries. Niccolò Machiavelli, who grew up in Florence during the later Medici period and served in the republican government that briefly replaced them, spent considerable effort analysing how the Medici had achieved and maintained their dominance. His famous work, The Prince, is often read as a handbook for tyrants, but it's more accurately understood as a meditation on power in all its forms, including the subtle, indirect power that Cosimo had pioneered. Machiavelli understood that brute force was the crudest and often least effective way to rule. The truly successful princes were those who combined force with cunning, legitimacy with manipulation, appearances with realities. Now, ruling from the shadows is all well and good, but shadows don't build monuments. If the Medici had simply accumulated power and wealth without leaving any visible trace, they would be a footnote in history, an interesting case study for political scientists perhaps, but not the legendary dynasty we remember today. What transformed them from clever politicians into immortal names was their second great innovation: the systematic use of art and culture as instruments of power. This brings us to the Medici as patrons, a role that would prove even more important to their legacy than their banking or their politics. The connection between wealth and art patronage was nothing new in Renaissance Italy. Rich people had been commissioning paintings and buildings since, well, forever. What distinguished the Medici approach was its scale, its sophistication, and its strategic integration with their political agenda. They didn't just buy art because they liked pretty things, though they did like pretty things and had remarkably good taste in them. They used art to construct an image, to communicate messages, and to embed themselves so deeply into Florence's identity that removing them became unimaginable. Cosimo de' Medici's expenditure on patronage was astronomical by any standard. According to records compiled by his grandson Lorenzo, the family spent over 663,000 florins on buildings, charities, and taxes between 1434 and 1471. That's an average of over 17,000 florins per year on public generosity. Remember, when a skilled worker earned perhaps 30 florins annually. Some of this spending was genuine charity, support for hospitals, assistance to the poor, maintenance of religious institutions. But a substantial portion went to buildings and artworks that, while nominally public or religious, served unmistakably to glorify the Medici name. Consider the Church of San Lorenzo, the Medici's parish church and eventual burial place. Cosimo commissioned Filippo Brunelleschi, the greatest architect of the age, to redesign and expand it. The result was a masterpiece of Renaissance architecture, harmonious proportions, classical references, elegant simplicity. It was also, and not incidentally, a massive advertisement for Medici piety and generosity. The Medici coat of arms appeared throughout the building. The family chapel featured prominently. When Cosimo died, he was buried beneath the high altar, directly in front of where the priest stood during Mass, a position of the honour usually reserved for saints. Not bad for a banker from the wool trade. The San Lorenzo project took decades to complete and went through various phases as the Medici ambition and available funds expanded over time. What began as a relatively modest renovation eventually became one of the most important architectural projects of the 15th century. Brunelleschi designed the old sacristy, a geometric marvel of domes and arches that influenced architects for centuries. Later, Michelangelo would add the new sacristy and the famous Florentian library, extending the family's architectural legacy into the 16th century. The church became a Medici mausoleum, packed with family tombs and memorials that turned visits into pilgrimages to the altar of banking greatness. Brunelleschi himself was a fascinating figure, a goldsmith turned architect who had famously won the competition to build the dome of Florence Cathedral, one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the medieval world. His relationship with Cosimo was sometimes tense. Brunelleschi was brilliant but temperamental, convinced of his own genius and not always willing to accommodate patrons' wishes. Cosimo handled him carefully, recognizing that artistic temperament was part of the package when you hired the best. The negotiations, compromises, and occasional conflicts between patron and architect reveal how Renaissance patronage actually worked, not as simple command and obey, but as complex relationships between strong personalities with different but overlapping interests. Brunelleschi was just one of the artistic geniuses who worked for the Medici. Donatello, arguably the greatest sculptor before Michelangelo, enjoyed Cosimo's patronage for decades. His bronze David, the first freestanding nude sculpture since antiquity, was commissioned for the Medici Palace, where it stood in the central courtyard, visible to anyone who visited. The symbolism was not subtle. David, the young underdog who defeated the giant Goliath through courage and divine favour, represented Florence itself, a small republic surrounded by larger, more powerful states, surviving through wit and virtue rather than brute strength. By placing this David in their home, the Medici associated themselves with Florence's self-image, positioning themselves as champions of the city's independence. The sculptor was also famous for his unconventional lifestyle and difficult personality. Donatello dressed poorly, ignored social conventions, and cared nothing for money or status. Cosimo reportedly paid him by leaving florins in a basket at the studio, since direct payment embarrassed the artist. When Donatello grew old and could no longer work, Cosimo arranged for a pension that continued after both their deaths. Lorenzo de' Medici honoured his grandfather's commitment. This kind of personal relationship between patron and artist was typical of Medici patronage. They didn't simply commission works and walk away. They cultivated ongoing connections with the creative people they supported, integrating them into their social world and benefiting from the reflected prestige of artistic genius. Michelozzo di Bartolomeo was the architect who designed the Palazzo Medici itself, as well as numerous other Medici commissions, including the renovation of the convent of San Marco. This Dominican monastery became a particular focus of Cosimo's patronage. He funded its complete reconstruction, established a substantial library there, and maintained close relationships with its friars. The painter Fra Angelico, himself a Dominican, decorated the monastery with frescoes that remain among the most beloved images of the Renaissance. Cosimo had a private cell reserved for his own use when he wanted to retreat from worldly affairs for meditation and prayer, a nice touch that suggested he was not just rich, but spiritually serious. The San Marco Library deserves special mention because it illustrates how Medici patronage worked on multiple levels simultaneously. Cosimo assembled a remarkable collection of ancient manuscripts, both Latin and Greek, and made them available to scholars at San Marco. This was one of the first semi-public libraries in Europe, and it attracted intellectuals from across the continent who came to Florence specifically to access texts they couldn't find elsewhere. The librarian Cosimo appointed, Tommaso Parentucelli, later became Pope Nicholas V and founded the Vatican Library, partly modelled on what he had seen at San Marco. Even Cosimo's charitable projects had a way of paying dividends. These scholars then wrote works that praised Florence and the Medici, spread word of the city's cultural riches, and established the intellectual networks that would fuel Renaissance humanism. The library was simultaneously a genuine contribution to learning, a magnet for talent, and a tool for enhancing Medici prestige. It cost a fortune, and it was worth every florin. Cosimo also understood that his patronage needed to extend beyond the elite. While he cultivated artists and philosophers, he simultaneously maintained support among ordinary Florentines through more practical generosity. He paid taxes, lots of taxes, at rates that exceeded what was strictly required, building political capital by being seen as a citizen who contributed more than his share to public expenses. In an era when wealthy families routinely evaded taxation through creative accounting and political manipulation, Cosimo's willingness to pay up was noteworthy. It won him support among the populace and made it harder for rivals to paint him as a greedy oligarch enriching himself at public expense. He also funded practical projects that benefited common people, repairs to roads and bridges, improvements to public buildings, support for guilds and their members. When workers fell on hard times, they might receive assistance from Medici-funded charities. When young craftsmen needed loans to start businesses, the Medici Bank was often willing to lend on favourable terms. This created a vast network of ordinary citizens who had personal reasons to support Medici interests, not because they were paid cronies, but because they had experienced Medici generosity directly. It was welfare politics 5 centuries before the term existed. The Medici taste in art was not merely showy or propagandistic. They genuinely appreciated quality and innovation, and their patronage consistently supported artists who were pushing boundaries. This attracted talent in a self-reinforcing cycle. The best artists wanted to work in Florence because Florence was where the best patrons were, and the best patrons were in Florence because that's where the best artists gathered. By the mid-15th century, the city had become the undisputed centre of Italian Renaissance art, and the Medici were at the centre of that centre. Let's talk about what this patronage actually meant in practical terms for the artists involved. Renaissance art was not the romantic, solitary enterprise we sometimes imagine today. It was a business. Artists ran workshops, employed assistants, managed commissions, and worried about cash flow like any other tradespeople. A major patron like the Medici could provide steady work, reliable payment, and freedom to experiment, luxuries that struggling artists desperately needed. In return, the patron got not just finished artworks but ongoing relationships with creative geniuses who could advise on aesthetic matters, enhance social gatherings, and lend cultural prestige to everything associated with their name. Cosimo's patronage extended beyond visual arts to include scholarship and philosophy. He was instrumental in establishing what became known as the Platonic Academy, an informal gathering of intellectuals devoted to studying and discussing the works of Plato. This might sound like a rich man's hobby, and it partly was, but it had profound consequences for Western thought. The rediscovery of Plato, whose works had been largely unknown in medieval Europe, sparked a philosophical revolution. Neoplatonism, the synthesis of Platonic ideas with Christian theology, became one of the defining intellectual movements of the Renaissance, and it happened in Florence, funded by Medici money, in conversations that often took place in Medici homes. The driving force behind the Platonic Academy was Marsilio Ficino, a scholar whom Cosimo essentially adopted as a kind of intellectual son. The story of their relationship begins when Ficino was still young, the son of Cosimo's personal physician. Cosimo noticed the boy's exceptional intellect and decided to invest in his education, a characteristic Medici move, identifying talent early and cultivating it for future benefit. He sent Ficino to study Greek, then a rare skill in Western Europe, with the explicit goal of translating Plato's complete works into Latin. Cosimo provided Ficino with a house in Careggi, near the Medici villa outside Florence, along with financial support and access to manuscripts. This patronage freed Ficino from the need to earn a living through ordinary employment, allowing him to devote his entire life to scholarship. In return, Ficino translated not only Plato but also Plotinus, the Hermetic writings, and other texts that Cosimo considered valuable. The villa at Careggi became a gathering place for intellectuals who shared Ficino's interests, forming the nucleus of what became the Platonic Academy. This academy wasn't a formal institution with buildings and degrees. It was more like an intellectual salon, a network of friends and correspondents who met irregularly to discuss philosophy, share ideas, and celebrate Plato's birthday with annual banquets. The informality was part of its appeal. Here were some of the finest minds of the age, gathered not in a university lecture hall but in a garden or a dining room, conversing as equals on the highest questions of human existence. And at the centre of it all, providing the venue, the funding, and the social occasion, was Cosimo de' Medici, the banker who had made it all possible. Ficino's translations made Plato accessible to Western readers for the first time in centuries, and his commentaries shaped how generations of thinkers understood ancient philosophy. When people today talk about Platonic love or invoke Platonic idealism, they're drawing on concepts that Ficino developed and that Cosimo funded. The banking fortune of a Florentine merchant helped determine the vocabulary of Western philosophy. Not bad for a return on investment. The relationship between the Medici and their artists was more complex than simple employment. There was genuine affection in many cases, along with mutual admiration and sometimes friction. Cosimo was known to visit artists in their workshops, discussing projects and offering suggestions that were probably not entirely optional. He had strong opinions about what he wanted and was willing to pay for the best, but he also seems to have respected artistic expertise and given talented people room to create. The results speak for themselves. The art produced under Medici patronage includes some of the greatest achievements in Western visual culture. But we shouldn't be naive about what was happening here. Medici patronage was never purely about aesthetic appreciation or the disinterested advancement of learning. Every church, every painting, every sculpture, every library served to reinforce the family's position. When citizens walked through Florence, they saw Medici symbols everywhere, on buildings they prayed in, on artworks they admired, on institutions they depended on. The message was constant and inescapable. The Medici are great, the Medici are generous, the Medici are everywhere, the Medici are Florence. This saturation of public space with family branding was a form of soft power that complemented the hard power of political manipulation and financial leverage. The religious aspect of Medici patronage was particularly important. In an age when everyone believed in heaven and hell, when the church dominated social life, and when piety was essential to respectability, conspicuous religious giving was both expected and advantageous. The Medici built churches, funded monasteries, commissioned altarpieces, and supported religious orders. This demonstrated their Christian virtue, essential for any family that wanted to be taken seriously, while also providing platforms for family glorification that would have been unseemly in purely secular contexts. You couldn't put your coat of arms on your own house without seeming arrogant, but you could absolutely plaster it all over a church you'd built for the greater glory of God. The sacred context sanctified the family ambition. There was also an element of what we might today call reputation laundering. Banking, as we've discussed, was theologically problematic. Lending money at interest was technically sinful, regardless of how creatively you structured the transactions. The Medici dealt in sin every business day, which created awkward questions about their ultimate spiritual destination. Generous religious patronage served as a kind of insurance policy, a way of using ill-gotten gains for holy purposes that might balance the celestial books. Cosimo is said to have worried about this explicitly, and his massive expenditure on churches and monasteries was partly motivated by genuine concern for his soul. Whether God was impressed, we cannot say, but Florence certainly was. The cultural hegemony the Medici established proved remarkably durable. Long after the specific political arrangements of the 15th century faded, the association between the Medici name and artistic greatness remained. When we think of the Renaissance today, we think of Florence. When we think of Florence, we think of the Medici. This equation was not accidental. It was constructed deliberately and expensively through decades of patronage that linked the family inextricably to the greatest creative achievements of their age. Cosimo and his descendants understood that political power is temporary, but cultural monuments last. A shrewd investment in immortality, as it turned out. Lorenzo de' Medici, Cosimo's grandson, would eventually spend nearly 700,000 florins on patronage, parties, and public spectacles, a sum so vast it actually threatened the family's financial stability. Lorenzo was a worse banker than his grandfather, but perhaps an even better patron, supporting artists like Botticelli, the young Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci during their formative years. The talent that passed through Medici circles during Lorenzo's era reads like a who's who of Renaissance genius. But this was built on Cosimo's foundation. Lorenzo inherited not just money, but a system, a network, a way of doing things that had been refined over decades. The Medici also understood the power of public spectacle in ways that seem remarkably modern. They funded festivals, tournaments, and celebrations that gave ordinary Florentines a stake in the family's prestige. When a Medici hosted a magnificent joust, the whole city participated, as spectators, as craftspeople who built the sets and costumes, as vendors who fed the crowds. These events created shared experiences that bound the community together with the family at its centre. It's not so different from a modern corporation sponsoring a sports stadium or a music festival. The goal is to associate the brand with positive emotions and collective identity. The visual propaganda of Medici patronage was sophisticated in ways we don't always appreciate. When Benozzo Gozzoli painted the Chapel of the Magi in the Palazzo Medici, he depicted the three wise men journeying to worship the infant Christ. But the faces of the Magi were portraits of the Medici family and their allies, and the landscape they travelled through was recognisably Tuscan. The message was clear. The Medici were like the wise kings of Scripture, noble figures bringing gifts to sacred purposes. This wasn't subtle, but it didn't need to be. It was meant to be seen and understood by everyone who entered the chapel, which included most of Florence's elite at one point or another. Similar strategies appeared throughout Medici commissions. Religious paintings featured donor portraits, images of the Medici themselves kneeling in prayer alongside saints and angels. Architectural projects incorporated family symbols in ways that ensured every visitor would know who had paid for the building. Even the books in the San Marco library bore the Medici coat of arms on their bindings. This ubiquitous branding created what modern marketers might call top-of-mind awareness. The Medici name was constantly present, constantly associated with beauty, learning, and piety. Over time, this association became so natural that people stopped noticing it as propaganda and simply accepted it as fact. The family's intellectual patronage had equally long-lasting effects. The revival of classical learning that the Medici supported became the foundation of Renaissance humanism, which in turn shaped European education, literature, and thought for centuries. When students today study the liberal arts, when scholars translate ancient texts, when philosophers debate Platonic versus Aristotelian ideas, they're working within traditions that the Medici helped establish. The money that flowed from Giovanni de' Bicci's banking operations to Cosimo's cultural projects, to the workshops of artists and the studies of scholars, ultimately helped create the modern Western understanding of what it means to be educated and cultured. That's quite a legacy for a family of former village doctors. We should pause here to appreciate the ambition of what the Medici attempted and achieved. They weren't just trying to get rich, though they did that. They weren't just trying to gain power, though they did that too. They were trying to reshape the very categories through which people understood wealth, power, and culture, to make themselves essential not just to Florence's politics but to its identity. And they succeeded so thoroughly that their success looks, in retrospect, almost inevitable. Of course, Florence became the centre of the Renaissance. Of course, the Medici became its patrons. Of course, their name became synonymous with art and learning. But none of this was inevitable. It was the result of conscious choices, strategic investments, and sustained effort across generations. Cosimo de' Medici died in 1464, having spent 3 decades as Florence's uncrowned king. On his tomb, the city fathers placed an inscription declaring him Pater Patriae, father of his country. It was an honour previously given only to ancient Roman heroes like Cicero. For a man who had officially held no significant political office, who had merely been a banker with good taste and generous habits, this was a remarkable tribute. But it was also an accurate description of what Cosimo had become, not Florence's ruler in any formal sense, but its patriarch, its benefactor, the figure around whom the city's life had organised itself. His legacy to his descendants was more than money, though he left plenty of that. He left a system, a method for exercising power without seeming to, for translating wealth into influence and influence into cultural dominance. His grandson Lorenzo would perfect and extend this system, becoming the very emblem of Renaissance princely virtue. But the foundations were Cosimo's. The shadow government, the patronage networks, the intellectual circles, the political alliances, all of this originated in the decades when Cosimo the banker remade Florence in his family's image, so subtly that the city hardly noticed it was happening. The Medici model of power through culture has been imitated countless times since. Modern billionaires who fund museums and universities, who attach their names to buildings and programs, who seek to influence public discourse through philanthropy, they're following a playbook the Medici wrote 5 centuries ago. Whether this is admirable or troubling depends on your perspective. What's undeniable is that the Medici demonstrated, more clearly than anyone before or since, that money can be converted into immortality if you spend it wisely enough. They bought their way into history, and they got an excellent deal. As night deepens and we prepare to move forward in the Medici story, consider what we've witnessed. A family with no noble blood, no ancestral claims, no military force, managed to dominate one of Europe's most sophisticated cities for generations. They did it by understanding that power comes in many forms, that the most effective control is control that doesn't look like control, and that monuments last longer than memories. Cosimo de' Medici ruled Florence without ever being its ruler, and he stamped his name so indelibly on Western civilization that we still speak it with reverence today. The village doctor's descendants had come a very long way indeed, and they weren't finished climbing yet. In the winter of 1438, something extraordinary began happening in the streets of Florence. Exotic delegations started arriving from the east, men with long beards wearing strange robes, speaking Greek, and looking around at the Tuscan cityscape with a mixture of curiosity and mild condescension. These were representatives of the Byzantine Empire, the last remnant of Rome's eastern half, and they had come to discuss nothing less than the reunification of Christianity. The Great Schism of 1054 had split the faith into Catholic West and Orthodox East, and now, nearly 4 centuries later, there was finally a serious attempt to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. And Cosimo de' Medici had arranged for this historic summit to take place in his backyard. The Council of Florence, as it came to be known, was originally supposed to meet in Ferrara. The Pope had selected that city as the venue for what was officially called the 17th Ecumenical Council, intended to resolve the theological differences that had divided Eastern and Western Christianity for centuries. But Ferrara had a problem: plague. When epidemic disease started spreading through the city in early 1439, the council needed a new location, and Cosimo swooped in with an offer that was difficult to refuse. Florence would host the council, the Medici Bank would help cover the considerable expenses, and the city would provide accommodations for the hundreds of delegates, theologians and hangers-on who had travelled from as far as Constantinople and Moscow to participate. This was not pure altruism on Cosimo's part. When was anything with the Medici purely altruistic? Hosting the council brought enormous prestige to Florence, and by extension to its most prominent citizen. For several months the city became the centre of the Christian world, a neutral ground where the Pope of Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople could meet as equals to hash out their differences. Ambassadors from every major European power were present. The Byzantine Emperor himself, John VIII Palaeologus, arrived with a retinue of scholars, priests, and nobles. It was, in modern terms, like hosting the United Nations, the G20 summit, and the World Cup final simultaneously, except everyone was arguing about the nature of the Holy Spirit instead of economic policy. The theological issues at stake were genuinely complex, involving centuries of divergent practice and interpretation. The main sticking point was the filioque clause, a single Latin word meaning "and the Son," that had been added to the Nicene Creed in the Western Church, changing the description of the Holy Spirit from proceeding from the Father to proceeding from the Father and the Son. This might sound like hair-splitting to modern ears, and frankly it sounded like hair-splitting to some contemporaries as well. But to medieval theologians, these distinctions mattered enormously. The precise relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit wasn't abstract philosophy. It was the fundamental nature of God, and getting it wrong could mean eternal damnation for millions of souls. No pressure. Beyond the filioque, there were disputes about the use of leavened versus unleavened bread in communion, the existence of purgatory, the authority of the Pope over the entire Church, and various liturgical differences that had accumulated over 4 centuries of separation. Each side had developed its own traditions, its own interpretations, its own sense of identity defined partly in opposition to the other. Bridging these gaps would require theological creativity, diplomatic skill, and a willingness to compromise that was not always abundant among professional churchmen. The council sessions were held in various Florentine churches, with debates stretching over months as theologians argued in Latin and Greek, with interpreters struggling to convey subtle distinctions across linguistic barriers. It was intellectually demanding work, not helped by the fact that many participants had travelled enormous distances under difficult conditions and were operating far from home in an unfamiliar city. The Byzantine delegation in particular was under pressure. The Ottoman Turks were steadily conquering what remained of their empire, and the Greeks desperately needed Western military aid. Theological compromise might be distasteful, but it was preferable to being overrun by Muslim armies. The practical challenges of hosting such an event were immense. Hundreds of delegates needed housing, food, and transportation. Translators had to be found who could work fluently in both Greek and Latin, a rare skill set that commanded premium wages. Church spaces had to be prepared for formal sessions, and secular venues arranged for the inevitable informal negotiations that happened outside official channels. Security was a concern given the valuable individuals and documents present. And of course, everything needed to be paid for, a burden that fell heavily on the Medici Bank, which extended credit to the papal treasury to cover expenses that exceeded initial budgets. The city's craftsmen and merchants benefited enormously from the council's presence. Tailors produced robes for delegates, innkeepers filled their rooms at premium rates. Booksellers and scribes saw increased demand from scholars who wanted to acquire or copy manuscripts. Goldsmiths created ceremonial objects. Food vendors served crowds of onlookers who gathered to watch the exotic processions. For several months, Florence's economy received a substantial stimulus from the ecclesiastical tourism that the council generated. Cosimo understood that civic events could drive economic activity, a principle that modern cities with their convention centres and sports stadiums would recognise immediately. The cultural exchange went beyond formal philosophy lectures. Byzantine visitors brought fashions, art styles, and aesthetic sensibilities that influenced Florentine taste. The distinctive hats worn by Greek clergy, tall, cylindrical headgear quite different from Western ecclesiastical fashion, appeared in paintings produced after the council, as artists incorporated exotic visual elements into their work. Byzantine icons, with their gold backgrounds and stylized figures, offered alternatives to the increasingly naturalistic Western painting tradition. The encounter between these two artistic traditions helped fertilize the creative ferment of the Florentine Renaissance. Cosimo worked behind the scenes throughout, ensuring the council had what it needed, smoothing over logistical problems, and cultivating relationships with the distinguished visitors. His hospitality was legendary. The Medici Bank covered expenses that other hosts might have struggled to afford, and Florence's wealthy families competed to entertain the foreign guests. The city put its best foot forward, showcasing its architecture, its art, its sophisticated urban culture. For visitors from Constantinople, itself a magnificent city, but one increasingly impoverished and besieged, Florence must have seemed both impressively prosperous and slightly provincial. These Greeks came from a civilization that traced its lineage directly to ancient Rome and classical Athens. Florence was wealthy, yes, but it was young, and its pretensions to cultural greatness were still being established. What happened during those months of theological debate would change European intellectual history, though not in the way the Pope had intended. Among the Byzantine delegation were scholars who brought with them something precious: knowledge of Greek language, literature, and philosophy that had been largely lost to the West during the medieval period. George Gemistos Plethon, an elderly philosopher from the Peloponnese, attended the council and used his time in Florence to lecture on Plato to anyone who would listen. Plethon was essentially a pagan masquerading as a Christian. He believed the ancient Greek gods represented a higher truth than Christianity, though he was wise enough not to advertise this too loudly. His enthusiasm for Plato was infectious, and his lectures drew crowds of Florentine intellectuals who had never encountered the original Greek texts of the ancient master. Cosimo attended these lectures and was captivated. Plato had been known in medieval Europe primarily through second-hand accounts and partial translations, overshadowed by Aristotle, whose works had been preserved and transmitted through Arabic scholarship. But here was someone who could read Plato in the original Greek, who understood the text intimately, who could open windows onto an intellectual tradition that the West had almost forgotten. Cosimo's decision to establish the Platonic Academy, discussed in our previous chapter, grew directly from this encounter with Plethon and the other Greek scholars who visited Florence during the council. Cardinal Bessarion was another influential figure from the Byzantine delegation. Unlike Plethon, Bessarion was a genuine churchman who eventually converted to Catholicism, became a cardinal, and nearly became pope. He was also a passionate collector of Greek manuscripts, and his library, eventually donated to Venice, where it formed the core of the Bibliotheca Marciana, preserved countless ancient texts that might otherwise have been lost when Constantinople fell. To the Ottomans in 1453, Bessarion spent considerable time in Florence during and after the council, and his influence on Italian intellectual life was profound. He represented a bridge between dying Byzantium and rising Renaissance Italy, carrying the treasures of one civilization to plant them in the soil of another. The council itself achieved what looked like success. In July 1439, a decree of union was signed, proclaiming the reunification of the Eastern and Western churches. The filioque was accepted with some diplomatic fudging. The Pope's supremacy was acknowledged, though with qualifications. The bells of Florence rang out in celebration, and for a brief moment it seemed that one of Christianity's deepest wounds had been healed. Cosimo had hosted a triumph of diplomacy and theology, bringing together what had been divided for 4 centuries, except it didn't stick. When the Byzantine delegates returned home with their decree of union, they discovered that most of the Orthodox faithful wanted nothing to do with it. The agreement had been made under pressure by delegates far from home without consulting the broader church community. The promised Western military aid never materialized in sufficient quantities to save Constantinople from the Ottomans. When the city finally fell in 1453, many Orthodox Christians saw it as divine punishment for the attempted union with Rome. Better Turkish turbans than papal tiaras, as the saying went. The Council of Florence's religious achievement evaporated, leaving behind only the memory of what might have been. But here's the irony. The Council's failure as a religious event was matched by its success as a cultural catalyst. The Greek scholars who came to Florence didn't just participate in theological debates, they sparked an intellectual revolution. Plethon's lectures inspired Cosimo's patronage of Marsilio Ficino, whose translations of Plato transformed Western philosophy. Bessarion's manuscript collecting helped preserve classical texts that became foundational to Renaissance humanism. Other Greek visitors taught languages, shared knowledge, and established connections that continued long after the council ended. The attempt to heal the church failed, but the attempt to recover ancient wisdom succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Florence emerged from the council with enhanced prestige, expanded intellectual networks, and a reputation as a centre of learning and culture that would only grow in subsequent decades. Cosimo had invested heavily in making the council happen, paying bills, hosting dignitaries, ensuring everything ran smoothly, and his return on investment was measured in something more valuable than florins, intellectual capital that would compound. For centuries, the Platonic Academy, the revival of Greek studies, the philosophical revolution that reshaped Renaissance thought, all of this traced back in part to those months when Byzantium came to Florence and the Medici picked up the tab. The council also demonstrated Cosimo's diplomatic skills on the international stage. He had cultivated relationships with popes, emperors, and cardinals, positioning himself as an indispensable intermediary in the highest levels of European affairs. This was not the work of a mere banker, no matter how wealthy. This was statecraft, conducted by a private citizen who technically held no office and commanded no armies. The Medici had arrived as players in the great game of international politics, and they would never entirely leave the table. Now let us move forward 4 decades, from this moment of diplomatic triumph to a day that would reveal the darker costs of Medici dominance. By 1478, much had changed. Cosimo had died in 1464, his son Piero had followed in 1469, and power had passed to Cosimo's grandson, Lorenzo de' Medici, known to history as Lorenzo the Magnificent. At just 20 years old when he assumed leadership of the family, Lorenzo had grown into a figure of remarkable complexity. Poet, patron, politician, and by now, the uncrowned ruler of Florence in the fullest sense of the term. Lorenzo had continued and expanded the Medici tradition of informal dominance. He was more openly controlling than his grandfather had been, less careful about maintaining republican appearances. He manipulated elections, packed councils with supporters, and concentrated power in ways that made some Florentines uneasy. But he also dazzled with his cultural patronage, his personal charisma, and his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of Italian diplomacy. Lorenzo was the Renaissance prince before that term existed, the embodiment of an ideal that combined intellectual refinement with political cunning. Not everyone was dazzled, though. The Medici's rise had created enemies, families who had been pushed aside, politicians who had been outmaneuvered, interests that had been trampled. Among the most resentful were the Pazzi, a banking family with ancient noble lineage and substantial wealth of their own. The Pazzi had been important figures in Florence for centuries, and they did not appreciate being overshadowed by upstart pill pushers who had only emerged from obscurity a few generations earlier. The rivalry between Medici and Pazzi had been building for years, a slow accumulation of slights, competitive pressures, and wounded pride. The specific grievances were numerous. Lorenzo had manoeuvred to pass laws that disadvantaged Pazzi banking operations, favouring Medici interests in the lucrative trade with Rome. A Pazzi marriage alliance had been blocked through Medici intervention. Business deals had been stolen, contracts redirected, opportunities mysteriously closed just as the Pazzi were about to seize them. Whether these slights were as deliberate as the Pazzi believed, or simply the inevitable friction of competing in the same market, the resentment accumulated like pressure in a sealed vessel. The Pazzi had noble blood. They claimed descent from crusaders who had brought back sacred relics from Jerusalem, while the Medici had mere money. It galled them to watch these parvenus strut through Florence as though they owned the place, which, increasingly, they did. Francesco de' Pazzi was the driving force behind what became known as the Pazzi conspiracy. He was young, hot-tempered, and convinced that the Medici were tyrants who had stolen what rightfully belonged to older, nobler families. His uncle Jacopo, the head of the family, was more cautious. He had lived long enough to know that moving against the Medici was dangerous, but eventually Francesco's passion prevailed. The Pazzi decided to act, and they found a surprising ally, Pope Sixtus IV himself. Sixtus was one of the more worldly popes of an era not known for spiritual purity. He was primarily concerned with advancing his own family, the Della Rovere clan, and various nephews had received cardinalates, bishoprics, and territorial grants through his patronage. The Pope had clashed with Lorenzo over various issues, including the appointment of a new Archbishop of Pisa, which Lorenzo had opposed. Sixtus wanted that position for a member of his circle, but Lorenzo used his influence to block the appointment. The Pope was furious. When the Pazzi approached him with their plan to remove the Medici from power, Sixtus provided tacit support, though he famously stipulated that there should be no killing, a condition so absurdly unrealistic that everyone understood he was merely maintaining plausible deniability. The conspiracy involved an impressive cast of characters beyond the Pazzi family. Girolamo Riario, one of the Pope's nephews and the real power behind the papal throne, was deeply involved in the planning. Francesco Salviati, the Archbishop of Pisa, the same appointment Lorenzo had opposed, joined the plot, apparently eager for revenge against the man who had tried to keep him from his position. Condottieri were hired, soldiers were gathered, and elaborate plans were drawn up for seizing control of Florence once the Medici were eliminated. The original scheme called for killing Lorenzo and his younger brother Giuliano during a banquet, but this plan fell through when Giuliano failed to attend due to illness. A new opportunity presented itself. The brothers would both be present at High Mass in the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, the Duomo, on April 26, 1478, Easter Sunday. The conspirators decided to strike there, in the very heart of Florence's religious life, during the most sacred service of the Christian year. It was either boldly theatrical or monumentally sacrilegious, depending on your perspective. Probably both. The assassins divided their targets. Francesco de' Pazzi and Bernardo Bandini would kill Giuliano. Two priests, yes, priests, were assigned to kill Lorenzo. The original assassins for Lorenzo had backed out, apparently squeamish about committing murder in a church during Mass, so the clergy stepped in. Father Stefano da Bagnone and Father Antonio Maffei de Volterra had their own grudges against the Medici, and their religious vows apparently didn't extend to "thou shalt not kill." The attack was timed for the moment of the elevation of the host, when the congregation would be kneeling with heads bowed, the perfect moment for assassins to strike. What followed was chaos. At the appointed signal, the conspirators drew their weapons and attacked. Giuliano de' Medici never had a chance. Francesco de' Pazzi and Bandini fell on him with daggers, stabbing him repeatedly in a frenzy of violence. Giuliano suffered 19 stab wounds. Francesco was so enthusiastic that he actually stabbed himself in the thigh during the attack. The young Medici collapsed on the cathedral floor, bleeding out before the horrified congregation. He was 25 years old, handsome and popular, cut down in the prime of his life beneath the great dome that Brunelleschi had built, and Medici money had paid for. The cathedral erupted in pandemonium. Screams echoed off the marble walls. Worshippers scrambled for the exits, trampling each other in the rush to escape. Blood pooled on the ancient flagstones. The priests at the altar stumbled through their liturgy, uncertain whether to continue the Mass or flee. In the chaos, smoke from incense mixed with the copper smell of blood, creating a surreal atmosphere that witnesses would remember for the rest of their lives. This was supposed to be Easter, the celebration of a resurrection and hope. Instead, it had become a charnel house. Lorenzo, however, survived. The priests assigned to kill him proved less competent than the assassins who attacked Giuliano. They managed to wound Lorenzo in the neck, but the injury was not fatal, and Lorenzo, who was athletic, quick, and not inclined to die quietly, drew his sword and defended himself. His friends rallied around him, fighting off the attackers and creating a protective cordon that allowed Lorenzo to escape into the sacristy. The heavy bronze doors were slammed shut behind him, and Lorenzo was safe, wounded, traumatized, but alive. Outside the cathedral, the conspiracy was unraveling. Archbishop Salviati had led a group of armed men to seize the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of government, but the operation was botched. Salviati's nervousness aroused suspicion, and when fighting broke out, the government's guards overwhelmed the conspirators. The archbishop was captured, still wearing his ecclesiastical robes. The soldiers who were supposed to pour into Florence and secure the city never arrived in sufficient numbers. Poor coordination, confused signals, and the general chaos of the failed assassination had thrown the military plans into disarray. The Florentine people, meanwhile, were not reacting as the conspirators had hoped. The Pazzi had expected that once the Medici were dead, citizens would rally to their cause, grateful to be liberated from tyranny. Instead, the opposite happened. News of the attack spread through the city, and crowds began gathering, not to support the Pazzi, but to defend the Medici. "Palle! Palle!" they shouted, the rallying cry referring to the bulls on the Medici coat of arms. Whatever reservations some Florentines might have had about Medici dominance, they had no appetite for political violence in their cathedral on Easter Sunday. The conspiracy had miscalculated the public mood catastrophically. Lorenzo emerged from the sacristy once it was clear he was safe, showing himself to the crowd to prove he was alive. His neck wound was visible but not life-threatening, and his appearance galvanized his supporters. The hunt for conspirators began almost immediately, and what followed was a bloodbath that made the original assassination attempt look restrained. Florentine mobs, enraged by the attack on their city's leading family, roamed the streets looking for anyone connected to the conspiracy. Archbishop Salviati was dragged from the Palazzo della Signoria and hanged from a window while still wearing his vestments, a shocking end for a man of the cloth and a deliberate insult to papal authority. Francesco de' Pazzi, wounded from his self-inflicted stab wound, was captured hiding in his family's palazzo. He was tortured, then hanged alongside the archbishop. The bodies dangled from the government building, twisting in the wind, a grim warning to anyone who might contemplate similar actions. Jacopo de' Pazzi, the elderly family patriarch who had reluctantly agreed to the conspiracy, tried to flee the city but was captured by peasants in the countryside. He was brought back to Florence, tortured for information about other conspirators, and then hanged. But his story didn't end with death. The Florentines were so enraged at the Pazzi that Jacopo's corpse was dug up from its grave, dragged through the streets by a mob, and eventually thrown into the Arno River. According to some accounts, children fished the rotting body out and used it as a plaything before disposing of it again. The treatment of Jacopo's remains was extraordinary even by the violent standards of the time, a measure of how deeply the failed conspiracy had offended Florentine sensibilities. Bernardo Bandini, the other killer of Giuliano, managed to escape Florence and flee all the way to Constantinople, about as far as you could run in the 15th century. But Lorenzo had a long memory and longer reach. He pressured the Ottoman Sultan, of all people, to extradite Bandini back to Florence. The Sultan, apparently impressed by Lorenzo's diplomatic persistence, or simply uninterested in protecting a Christian assassin, complied. Bandini was shipped back to Italy and hanged in December 1479, more than a year and a half after the original attack. Leonardo da Vinci happened to be in Florence at the time and sketched the hanging body, noting the details of Bandini's clothing in his characteristic mirror writing. It's a chilling artifact, one of history's greatest artists casually documenting the execution of an assassin, a reminder of how intertwined art and violence were in Renaissance Florence. The reprisals extended far beyond the immediate conspirators. The Pazzi family as a whole was destroyed, their assets were confiscated, their name was literally erased, a law was passed forbidding anyone to use the Pazzi name, and buildings associated with the family were renamed. Family members who had nothing to do with the conspiracy were exiled or imprisoned. The Pazzi Bank collapsed, its clients fleeing to safer institutions. A family that had been prominent in Florence for centuries was effectively deleted from existence in a matter of months. Pope Sixtus IV was furious at the failure of the conspiracy, and even more furious at the treatment of his archbishop. He excommunicated Lorenzo and placed Florence under interdict, a papal sanction that theoretically prohibited all religious services in the city. He then allied with the King of Naples to wage war on Florence, hoping to achieve through military force what assassination had failed to accomplish. The war dragged on for 2 years, straining Florence's resources and threatening the very survival of the Medici regime. Lorenzo's response was characteristically audacious. In December 1479, he travelled personally to Naples to negotiate with King Ferrante, a ruler known for his cruelty and treachery. It was an enormous gamble. Ferrante had been known to imprison and murder diplomatic visitors, but Lorenzo calculated that bold action was needed to break the military deadlock. He spent 3 months in Naples negotiating, charming, and ultimately convincing Ferrante that a continued alliance with the Pope wasn't in Naples' interest. The Neapolitan king was impressed by Lorenzo's courage in putting himself at risk, and perhaps also recognized that a weakened Florence might open the door to more dangerous powers in northern Italy. Lorenzo returned to Florence in March 1480 with a peace agreement and was celebrated as a hero who had risked everything for his city. The timing of the peace proved fortunate. Just months after the agreement was signed, Ottoman forces attacked the Italian port of Otranto, briefly occupying the city and massacring much of its population. The Turkish threat suddenly seemed far more pressing than any Italian quarrel, and Pope Sixtus quietly dropped his vendetta against Florence to focus on this new danger. Lorenzo's diplomatic gamble had paid off in ways he couldn't have anticipated. External events had aligned to make peace necessary. The Pazzi conspiracy's aftermath fundamentally changed Florentine politics. Before 1478, the Medici had ruled through a complicated system of alliances, patronage, and electoral manipulation, always maintaining at least the pretense of republican legitimacy. After the conspiracy, Lorenzo concentrated power more openly, creating new institutions that gave him direct control over government decisions. The Council of 70, established in 1480, was packed with Medici loyalists and effectively sidelined the traditional councils that had previously preserved some degree of political competition. Florence was becoming less a republic with Medici influence and more a principality with republican decorations. The violence of 1478 also demonstrated something important about the nature of Medici power. It was now sustained not just by money and influence, but by genuine popular support. the mob that hunted down conspirators, that hanged an archbishop from a window, that dug up Jacopo Pazzi's corpse, this was not organised by Medici agents. It was spontaneous popular fury defending a family that Florentines had come to see as their own. Whatever the Medici's origins as outsiders and climbers, by 1478 they had been woven so deeply into Florence's identity that an attack on them was felt as an attack on the city itself. The conspiracy's failure was not just a matter of botched execution, it was a testament to how thoroughly the Medici had made themselves essential. Giuliano's death left deep scars. He had been the charming, handsome brother, more easygoing than Lorenzo, popular at court and beloved by the people. His murder, witnessed by hundreds of horrified worshippers on the holiest day of the year, was a trauma that Florence never quite forgot. Lorenzo mourned his brother deeply, and some historians have seen a darkening in his personality after 1478, a harder edge to his politics and a more cynical view of human nature. He had learned that even the most elaborate web of alliances and patronage couldn't protect you from a dagger in the dark. The artistic response to the conspiracy was significant. Sandro Botticelli, already one of Florence's most celebrated painters and a Medici favourite, was commissioned to paint frescoes of the hanged conspirators on the walls of the Bargello, a public shaming that would remind every passerby of the fate awaiting anyone who moved against the Medici. These images, now lost, showed the dangling bodies with identifying inscriptions, a gruesome gallery meant to discourage future plotters. Botticelli was also likely involved in the design of commemorative medals celebrating Lorenzo's survival. Art once again served Medici political purposes. Lorenzo commissioned a more conventional memorial as well, a wax effigy of himself, dressed in the bloodied clothes he had worn during the attack, was placed in the church of Santissima Annunziata. Pilgrims could see the actual garments stained with Lorenzo's blood and contemplate the miracle of his survival. This was simultaneously religious devotion and political propaganda, evidence of divine favour that legitimized Medici rule in the language Florentines understood best. If God had preserved Lorenzo, surely his leadership was blessed. There was, however, one unexpected legacy of the conspiracy. Giuliano had a young mistress who was pregnant at the time of his death. The child, born a few months after the assassination, was named Giulio, and he would grow up to become Pope Clement VII, one of the most consequential figures in the 16th century church. The Pazzi thought they were ending the Medici line, or at least severely wounding it. Instead, they created circumstances that would eventually place a Medici on the papal throne. History has a sense of irony that even the best conspirators can't anticipate. The failed conspiracy also had implications for how we think about tyranny and legitimacy. The Pazzi had framed their action as tyrannicide, the killing of a tyrant in defense of liberty. This was a classical tradition with respectable intellectual credentials. Brutus and Cassius had killed Caesar for similar reasons, and Renaissance humanists generally praised them for it. But the Florentine people rejected this framing. To them, Lorenzo was not a tyrant but a benefactor, not an oppressor but a protector. The conspiracy revealed that legitimacy comes not just from constitutional forms, but from popular perception, and the Medici had won that battle completely. As we reflect on this chapter of blood and revenge, consider the ironies that pile up. A council meant to unite Christianity produced instead a philosophical revolution. An assassination meant to free Florence bound it more tightly to Medici control. An archbishop who hoped to advance his career ended up hanged from a government window in his vestments. A family that traced its nobility back centuries was erased from memory by former peasants who had only recently risen to prominence. The Medici survived not because they were stronger or more virtuous than their enemies, but because they had understood something their enemies missed, that power ultimately rests on the consent of the governed, and that consent is earned not through fear alone, but through a complicated mixture of patronage, performance, and popular identification. Lorenzo would rule Florence for another 14 years after the Pazzi conspiracy, dying in 1492 at the age of 43. His reign would be remembered as a golden age of art and culture, the high point of Renaissance Florence, though the financial and political foundations he inherited would crumble shortly after his death. But that's a story for another chapter. For now, let us simply note that the blood spilled on the cathedral floor in 1478 marked both an end and a beginning, the end of any serious internal challenge to Medici dominance, and the beginning of a more openly princely style of rule that would eventually abandon Republican pretense altogether. The conspirators who struck on that Easter Sunday believed they were freeing their city. Instead, they forged chains that would bind it more tightly than ever. The Medici emerged from the cathedral, bloodied but unbroken, and Florence would remain in their grip for generations to come. Sometimes the surest way to strengthen a dynasty is to try to destroy it, and fail. The Pazzi learned this lesson at the cost of everything they had, and their very name became a byword for futile ambition. Erased from buildings, forbidden by law, and remembered only as villains in a story that belongs ultimately to the family they tried to kill. Lorenzo the Magnificent died in April 1492, and with him died an era. He was only 43 years old, worn out by gout, kidney disease, and the relentless demands of running Florence while pretending not to run it. On his deathbed, according to legend, he was visited by a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola, who came not to offer comfort but to demand repentance. The story goes that Savonarola refused to grant absolution unless Lorenzo restored full liberty to Florence and renounced the Medici's informal tyranny. Lorenzo, supposedly, turned his face to the wall and died without receiving the sacrament. Whether this actually happened is debated by historians. The account comes from sources hostile to Lorenzo, but it makes for excellent drama, and the symbolic confrontation between the dying Renaissance prince and the fiery preacher captures something true about what was coming. Lorenzo's son Piero inherited leadership of the family at age 20, and he proved spectacularly unequal to the task. Where his father had been charismatic, diplomatic, and shrewd, Piero was arrogant, indecisive, and remarkably tone-deaf to political realities. He had grown up as the golden child of Florence's first family, accustomed to deference and luxury, and he had never learned the careful cultivation of popular support that had sustained Medici power for 3 generations. His nickname, Piero the Unfortunate, suggests how posterity judged his brief tenure. Though to be fair, he was also unlucky, inheriting the family business just as a perfect storm of crises was about to break over Italy. The storm arrived in 1494 in the form of King Charles VIII of France, who marched a massive army down the Italian peninsula to press his dubious claim to the throne of Naples. Italian politics had long operated on the assumption that the major powers, Milan, Venice, Florence, the Papal States, and Naples, would balance against any external threat. This assumption proved wildly optimistic when actually tested. Charles's army was large, well equipped with newfangled artillery that could demolish medieval fortifications in hours rather than months, and the Italian states were caught completely unprepared. One by one, they scrambled to accommodate the French king rather than resist him. Charles himself was an unprepossessing figure, short, physically awkward, with an oversized head and reportedly unpleasant personal habits. But he commanded an army of 25,000 men, including Swiss mercenaries considered the finest infantry in Europe, and an artillery train that represented the cutting edge of military technology. The Italian peninsula, which had grown complacent during decades of relative peace, suddenly remembered that war was a possibility. Fortresses that had stood for centuries looked disturbingly vulnerable to French cannons. Armies that had sufficed for local conflicts seemed pathetically inadequate against a major European power. The invasion of 1494 was a wake-up call that Italian politics had changed forever. The French march through Italy was almost leisurely. Town after town opened its gates rather than face siege. Local rulers competed to offer hospitality, hoping to be spared destruction. The Pope himself, Alexander VI, that monument to ecclesiastical corruption, negotiated passage through the Papal States rather than risk confrontation. It was humiliating for Italian pride, and it demonstrated how thoroughly the balance of power had shifted. Italy was no longer the centre of the world. It was a battleground for greater powers, a prize to be fought over by foreign kings. Piero de' Medici's response to this crisis was, to put it charitably, suboptimal. As Charles approached Tuscany, Piero rode out to negotiate, a reasonable action in itself, and promptly surrendered virtually every strategic position Florence held, including the vital fortresses of Sarzana, Pietrasanta, and Pisa, without securing anything meaningful in return. He gave away in a single negotiation what generations of Florentine diplomacy and warfare had accumulated. When word of these terms reached Florence, the reaction was explosive. This wasn't diplomacy. It was capitulation. Piero had demonstrated that he was either too cowardly to resist or too stupid to negotiate, and neither quality was acceptable in the unofficial ruler of a proud republic. On November 9th, 1494, the Florentine Signoria summoned Piero to explain himself. He arrived at the Palazzo della Signoria with an armed escort, apparently planning to intimidate the government into accepting his disastrous treaty. Instead, he found the doors barred against him. The government had decided in the space of a few hours that 60 years of Medici dominance were over. Piero retreated to his palazzo, gathered what valuables he could carry, and fled the city with his brothers. The mob ransacked the Medici properties, and centuries of art collection, manuscript accumulation, and careful image building went up in the chaos of popular fury. The Medici were gone, and Florence was suddenly, vertiginously, free. Into this vacuum stepped a figure who seemed, at first, to be the opposite of everything the Medici had represented. Girolamo Savonarola was a Dominican friar from Ferrara, who had been preaching in Florence since 1490, initially at the invitation of Lorenzo himself, an invitation Lorenzo would have cause to regret had he lived long enough. Savonarola was small, physically unprepossessing, with a hooked nose and burning eyes that contemporaries found either terrifying or mesmerizing, depending on their susceptibility to his message. And what a message it was. Savonarola preached that Florence was doomed. The city had become a new Babylon, corrupted by wealth, luxury, and the false gods of classical antiquity that the humanists worshipped. The Medici had led the people astray with their banks and their paintings and their pagan philosophy. God was angry, and divine punishment was imminent unless Florence repented, reformed, and returned to the pure Christianity of the Apostolic Age. This was not a subtle message, and Savonarola did not deliver it subtly. His sermons were theatrical performances, hours-long denunciations delivered with passionate intensity, prophecies of doom alternating with visions of redemption, all aimed at an audience increasingly anxious about the French invasion and what it portended. The friar had a gift for vivid imagery that stayed with listeners long after they left the cathedral. He described visions of flaming swords descending from heaven, of armies of demons marching through Italian cities, of plagues and famines that would devastate the unrepentant. His voice could drop to a whisper that forced thousands of listeners to lean forward in silent attention, then rise to a thunderous crescendo that echoed off stone walls and seemed to shake the very foundations of the church. People came away from his sermons weeping, trembling, convinced they had heard the authentic voice of God speaking through this strange little Dominican with the burning eyes. Savonarola also had an uncanny ability to connect current events to biblical prophecy. When Charles VIII invaded Italy, the friar pointed to it as fulfillment of his predictions. He had warned that a new Cyrus would come from the north to chastise corrupt Italy, and here was Charles, arriving exactly as prophesied. When Florence escaped relatively unscathed from the invasion, Savonarola claimed credit. The city had been spared because of its repentance, its willingness to hear God's message. Every development, good or bad, confirmed his authority. Success proved God's favour. Suffering proved the need for more reform. It was an interpretive framework that was essentially unfalsifiable, and it made Savonarola's pronouncements seem increasingly reliable to people desperate for certainty. The remarkable thing is how many people believed him. Savonarola attracted enormous crowds to his sermons at the cathedral and at San Marco, the very monastery the Medici had rebuilt and funded. Thousands of Florentines became his devoted followers, known as the Piagnoni, or weepers, for the tears they shed during his preaching. These weren't just the poor and uneducated, though plenty of those joined the movement, but intellectuals, artists, and prominent citizens who found in Savonarola's vision an alternative to the cynical politics and worldly culture that had defined their city. Even some of the artists who had worked for the Medici were swept up. Sandro Botticelli, painter of the sensuous birth of Venus, apparently became a Savonarola supporter and may have destroyed some of his own earlier works as too pagan. What made Savonarola's appeal so potent was the context. Florence in 1494 was traumatized. The French invasion had revealed the weakness of Italian defences and the bankruptcy of the political system that had maintained peace for decades. The Medici, who had promised stability and prosperity, had proven hollow when tested. Traditional certainties were crumbling, and people reached for something, anything, that offered meaning in a world that suddenly seemed chaotic and threatening. Savonarola offered certainty, absolute moral clarity, divine guidance, and a path to salvation that required only submission to God's will, as interpreted by, conveniently, Girolamo Savonarola. The friar's political program was as radical as his theology. He proposed transforming Florence into a genuine theocracy, a city of God on earth, modelled on his interpretation of biblical principles. The old Medici-dominated institutions were swept away and replaced with a great council of several thousand citizens, theoretically giving more Florentines a voice in government than ever before. But this democratic expansion came with strict conditions. The Great Council's decisions were supposed to reflect divine will, and Savonarola positioned himself as the interpreter of that will. Citizens who disagreed were not merely political opponents, but enemies of God. It was democracy in form and theocracy in substance, a combination that proved extremely effective at consolidating power while maintaining a veneer of popular legitimacy. Savonarola's followers organized themselves into a kind of moral police force. Bands of young men and boys roamed the streets looking for signs of sin, women wearing immodest clothing, men playing dice or cards, taverns serving customers during prohibited hours, shops selling luxury goods, anyone enjoying themselves in ways the friar disapproved. These patrols could be intrusive, intimidating, and occasionally violent. Florentines who had grown up in the relatively tolerant atmosphere of Medici Florence found themselves suddenly living in a surveillance state run by zealous teenagers. Not exactly what most people had in mind when they celebrated their liberation from tyranny. The campaign against vanity escalated steadily through 1496 and early 1497. Savonarola had identified material luxury as one of the chief symptoms of Florence's spiritual corruption, and he was determined to root it out. His followers went door to door collecting objects deemed vanities: mirrors, cosmetics, fine clothing, jewellery, playing cards, musical instruments, books of poetry and philosophy, and artworks depicting pagan or sensual subjects. Some of these items were surrendered willingly by believers who genuinely wanted to purify their lives. Others were extracted through social pressure that bordered on extortion. If you wanted to remain in good standing with the new regime, you contributed to the collection. The climax came on February 7th, 1497, Shrove Tuesday, traditionally a day of carnival celebration before the austerity of Lent. In most of Italy, Shrove Tuesday meant feasting, dancing, and general revelry, a last fling before 40 days of fasting. In Savonarola's Florence, it meant something very different. In the Piazza della Signoria, the same square where the Pazzi conspirators had dangled from windows, workers had constructed an enormous wooden pyramid, 60 feet high and composed of 7 levels representing the 7 deadly sins. On each level were piled the vanities that Savonarola's followers had collected, thousands upon thousands of objects representing Florentine luxury and artistic culture. The inventory of what was burned that day reads like a catalogue of Renaissance civilization's finest products. Mirrors of silver and crystal, not just symbols of vanity but masterpieces of craftsmanship that had taken skilled artisans months to produce. Cosmetics and perfumes, the luxury goods that Florentine merchants had imported from across the Mediterranean, representing trade networks that spanned from Constantinople to Alexandria. Fine silks and brocades, textiles that represented centuries of accumulated weaving expertise, patterns and techniques passed down through generations of craftsmen. Playing cards and dice, games that had provided entertainment for generations, decorated with miniature paintings that were artworks in their own right. Musical instruments came next, lutes with inlaid wood and ivory, harps with gilded frames, viols and recorders and organs and every other tool of the sophisticated musical culture that Florence had helped pioneer. Some of these instruments were antiques, built by masters long dead and impossible to replace. Others were recent productions of living craftsmen who watched their work go up in flames. The silencing of these instruments was almost literal. Savonarola's Florence would have less music, less celebration, less of the joyful noise that the psalmist had praised. Books formed a substantial portion of the pyre, volumes of Latin and Greek poetry, including precious manuscripts that had survived from antiquity. Some of these may have been irreplaceable copies, the only existing texts of certain classical works. Ovid was particularly targeted, his tales of gods and transformations deemed too pagan for Christian consumption. Boccaccio, Florence's own literary hero, saw his Decameron consigned to the flames for its bawdy tales of clever monks and unfaithful wives. Works of philosophy, natural science, and history went into the fire alongside the poetry. Savonarola's vision of appropriate reading was considerably narrower than what Florentine humanists had cultivated. And then there were the paintings. Portraits, mythological scenes, anything depicting nudity or pagan subjects, potentially including works by significant artists, though we cannot know for certain what was lost. Paintings of Venus and Mars, of nymphs and satyrs, of all the classical figures that Renaissance artists had lovingly revived went into the pile. Even religious paintings could be condemned if they were too sensual, if the Virgin Mary looked too beautiful or the saints too worldly. The threshold for acceptable imagery was impossibly narrow, and painters who had spent their careers perfecting the human form watched as that mastery was declared sinful and destroyed. Furniture contributed to the pyre as well. Carved chairs and tables, decorated chests, anything displaying excessive ornamentation or worldly pride. Chess sets and backgammon boards, guilty of encouraging idle amusement. Carnival masks and costumes, those props of festive indulgence. Women's elaborate headdresses and the padding used to create fashionable silhouettes. Wigs and hair extensions. Vanity in its most literal form. The list seemed endless, a comprehensive catalogue of everything that made life in Florence pleasant, beautiful, or fun. As darkness fell, Savonarola's followers set the pyramid ablaze. The fire burned through the night, consuming in hours what had taken generations to create. The crowd watched, some cheering, some weeping, some simply stunned, as the material culture of the Renaissance went up in smoke. Church bells rang throughout the city, hymns were sung. It was, depending on your perspective, either a glorious purification of corrupted civilization or an act of cultural vandalism that beggars description. The bonfire of the vanities was anti-Renaissance made manifest, a deliberate systematic destruction of the beautiful, the pleasurable, the classical, the humanistic, everything the Medici and their circle had spent decades cultivating. Contemporary accounts describe the scene in vivid terms. The heat was intense enough that people had to stand back from the plaza. Sparks rose into the sky like prayers ascending to heaven, or like the souls of condemned artworks screaming as they were destroyed. The smell of burning fabric, leather, wood, and paint hung over the city for days. Some observers claimed to feel a sense of spiritual cleansing, a lightness that came from renouncing worldly attachments. Others felt only horror at what was being lost. A Venetian merchant reportedly offered 20,000 florins to purchase the collection rather than see it destroyed. Savonarola's followers painted his portrait and threw it on the fire instead. It's worth pausing to consider what was actually destroyed. We know the general categories, but the specific losses remain largely unknown. Were any masterpieces by major artists burned that day? Almost certainly some significant works were lost. Botticelli may have contributed his own paintings, and other artists likely did as well. Were unique manuscripts destroyed? Probably, though again we cannot say which ones. The bonfire of the vanities represents a gap in our knowledge of Renaissance culture, a void where objects used to exist that we can now only imagine. Every time art historians note that a painting is lost or a text no longer survives, there's a chance it ended up on that pyre in 1497. The cultural destruction was accompanied by social destruction. Savonarola's regime conducted what amounted to a reign of moral terror, prosecuting citizens for offences ranging from sodomy to gambling to blasphemy. The penalties could be severe: fines, imprisonment, exile, even death for particularly egregious sins. The city's famous tolerance — Florence had long been known for its relatively relaxed attitudes toward homosexuality, for instance — evaporated under Savonarola's rule. Artists, intellectuals, and anyone associated with the old Medici order found themselves under suspicion. Some fled the city, others kept their heads down and waited for the storm to pass. A few genuinely converted to Savonarola's vision and became enthusiastic enforcers of the new morality. But Savonarola had enemies, and they were growing bolder. The most powerful was Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, one of the most corrupt men ever to wear the papal tiara, which is really saying something. Alexander had multiple children by various mistresses, engaged in nepotism that made the Medici look restrained, and was widely suspected of murder, simony, and every other sin the Renaissance papacy could offer. He was, in short, exactly the kind of target Savonarola loved to denounce, and the friar had been denouncing him loudly and specifically for years. Alexander initially tried to co-opt Savonarola. He offered him a cardinal's hat if he would just quiet down, but the friar refused. You cannot bribe a true believer. The Pope's patience ran out in 1497. He excommunicated Savonarola, forbidding him from preaching and declaring him cut off from the church. For most clergy, this would have been devastating. Excommunication meant damnation, exclusion from the sacraments, spiritual death. Savonarola responded by denying the Pope's authority to excommunicate him, essentially arguing that Alexander was so corrupt that his papal acts were invalid. This was theologically dubious and politically dangerous. Savonarola was now claiming the right to judge the Pope rather than be judged by him, a position that put him outside the mainstream of Catholic teaching and made him vulnerable to charges of heresy. Meanwhile, Florence was growing tired. The economic costs of Savonarola's rule were becoming apparent. Merchants couldn't conduct business normally under constant moral surveillance. Tourists and traders avoided a city known for burning artwork and prosecuting pleasure, and the commercial. Vitality that had made Florence wealthy was draining away. The political situation remained unstable, with threats from neighbouring states and ongoing tensions with Rome, and many Florentines simply missed the old pleasures, the festivals, the entertainments, the casual enjoyments that Savonarola had banned. A city cannot live on sermons alone, even very compelling sermons. The end came through a bizarre episode that revealed the limits of Savonarola's appeal. In April 1498, a Franciscan friar named Francesco da Puglia challenged the Dominicans to an ordeal by fire, a medieval practice in which two parties would walk through flames, with God protecting the righteous and destroying the guilty. The challenge was essentially a dare. If Savonarola was truly a prophet, let him prove it by surviving fire unscathed. It was a throwback to an earlier age, the kind of trial that educated people had largely abandoned as superstitious, but it captured the popular imagination. Savonarola himself was reluctant to participate. He seems to have recognized that walking through fire was unlikely to end well regardless of one's theological correctness, but his followers were eager. Fra Domenico da Pescia, one of Savonarola's closest associates, volunteered to enter the flames on behalf of the Dominicans. The Franciscans produced their own champion. The stage was set for a spectacle that would decisively prove or disprove Savonarola's claims to divine inspiration. A huge crowd gathered in the Piazza della Signoria on April 7th, 1498, the same square that had witnessed the bonfire of the Vanities. Temporary structures were erected to create a corridor of flames through which the champions would walk. Wagons loaded with brushwood and kindling stood ready. The entire city seemed to hold its breath. But then the delays began. The Franciscans objected that Fra Domenico planned to carry a crucifix into the fire. The Dominicans insisted this was acceptable. Hours of negotiation followed. Then the Franciscans objected to Fra Domenico's robes. Perhaps they had been enchanted with protective spells. More negotiation. The Dominicans wanted to bring the consecrated host into the flames. The Franciscans and civil authorities objected that this would be sacrilege. The arguments went back and forth while the crowd grew increasingly restless, and the afternoon wore on. Eventually rain began to fall, the crowd grew restless and angry, and the whole event was called off without anyone actually entering the fire. It was a fiasco that made Savonarola look either cowardly or fraudulent, and his popularity never recovered. The very next day a mob attacked San Marco, and the government moved against Savonarola. He was arrested along with two of his closest associates and subjected to interrogation that included torture. Under questioning, and the rack was remarkably effective at extracting confessions, Savonarola admitted to various charges, including falsely claiming divine inspiration for his prophecies. He later recanted the confession, saying it had been coerced but the damage was done. The torture sessions were extensive and brutal. Savonarola was subjected to the strappado, a technique where the victim's hands are tied behind their back. They are hoisted into the air by their wrists, and then dropped suddenly, dislocating shoulders and causing excruciating pain. After several sessions of this treatment, the friar who had thundered against papal corruption from his pulpit was reduced to signing whatever his interrogators put in front of him. The confessions extracted under these conditions were legally dubious even by 15th century standards, but they served the government's purpose. They provided justification for execution. The Pope sent commissioners to conduct a formal trial, and the outcome was never in doubt. Savonarola, Fra Domenico, and Fra Silvestro were condemned as heretics and schismatics. The specific charges included claiming false prophecies, causing schism in the church, and various doctrinal errors. Whether any of these charges were actually valid was almost beside the point. Savonarola had defied the Pope, disrupted Florentine society, and made powerful enemies. Now he would pay the price. On May 23, 1498, almost exactly 1 year after the first bonfire of the Vanities, Girolamo Savonarola met his end in the same Piazza della Signoria, where he had orchestrated the destruction of Florence's vanities. A scaffold was erected in the centre of the square, and the 3 condemned friars were led out in their degraded robes, stripped of their priestly vestments to signify their expulsion from the church. They were hanged first, to ensure they were dead before what came next, and then their bodies were burned. The pyre was positioned exactly where the bonfire of the Vanities had stood, and the symbolism was unmistakable. The destroyer of vanities had become a vanity himself, consumed by the same fire he had kindled. The crowd that watched Savonarola burn was not entirely hostile. Many of his followers wept openly, and some tried to collect relics from the ashes, fragments of bone, scraps of clothing, anything that might retain holy power. The authorities, aware of this danger, had the ashes carefully gathered and thrown into the Arno River to prevent any cult from developing around the dead friar. It didn't entirely work. Savonarola's memory persisted among the Piagnoni, who continued to venerate him as a martyr for decades. Some would later argue for his canonization, pointing to the corruption of his enemies and the purity of his intentions. The Catholic Church has never made him a saint, but neither has it entirely dismissed the possibility. What are we to make of Savonarola? He was certainly a remarkable figure, a man who, through sheer force of personality and conviction, temporarily overthrew the Medici's carefully constructed system and remade Florence according to his vision. He was sincere in his beliefs, genuinely convinced that he was doing God's work and that Florence could become a holy city if only it would listen to him. And some of his criticisms of contemporary society were not unreasonable. The gap between Christian teaching and Christian practice in late 15th century Italy was indeed vast, and someone calling for moral reform was not entirely wrong to do so. But Savonarola's methods were destructive, his vision ultimately impossible, and his legacy deeply ambiguous. The bonfire of the Vanities destroyed irreplaceable cultural treasures in the name of moral purity, a trade-off that most modern observers find horrifying. His political program combined genuine democratic reforms with authoritarian moral policing in ways that satisfied no one for long. And his defiance of papal authority, while admirable in some ways, placed him outside the structures that might have protected him when enemies moved against him. He was a prophet without a sustainable movement, a reformer without a realistic program, a spiritual leader who confused his own voice with the voice of God. The episode reveals something important about Renaissance Florence and about cultural achievement generally. The magnificent civilization the Medici had helped build was more fragile than it appeared. All those paintings, sculptures, books, and buildings represented accumulated investments of genius, skill, and resources, but they could be destroyed in a single night by people who rejected the values they embodied. Culture is never safe. It exists only so long as society chooses to preserve it, and that choice can be revoked by a sufficiently motivated movement with sufficiently different values. The bonfire of the Vanities was a reminder that the Renaissance was not inevitable, that its achievements were contingent on social conditions that could change, and that what one generation treasures another generation may throw on the fire. Florence recovered from Savonarola, though not immediately. The Medici returned in 1512, reimposed their control, and eventually became formal dukes of the city. The artistic and intellectual life that had been disrupted gradually resumed, though the golden age of the 15th century was never quite recaptured. Some things that burned in 1497 were truly lost forever. Others were recreated or replaced by new works and new styles. Life went on, as it does, and the bonfire of the Vanities became a historical curiosity, a strange episode when Florence briefly lost its mind and burned its heritage. But the memory lingered. Future generations would look back at Savonarola with a mixture of fascination and horror, seeing in his movement a warning about the dangers of religious extremism and the vulnerability of civilization to determined opponents. The friar became a symbol of fanaticism, his bonfire an emblem of cultural destruction that resonates to this day whenever books are burned or artworks smashed in the name of ideology. In trying to save Florence's soul, Savonarola had nearly destroyed its culture. In trying to oppose the corruption of his age, He had created a different kind of corruption, one that demanded conformity, punished pleasure, and measured virtue by what you were willing to burn. As the ashes of the friar floated down the Arno toward the sea, Florence began the slow process of putting itself back together. The Medici were still in exile, but their return was already being plotted. The artists who had survived the Savonarola years were ready to work again. And the values of the Renaissance, humanism, beauty, classical learning, the celebration of human achievement, would reassert themselves, perhaps more precious now that everyone had seen how easily they could be lost. The fire that consumed Savonarola also purged Florence of its brief experiment with theocracy. The city had looked into the face of radical moral purity and decided, on balance, that it preferred being magnificently sinful. The contrast between Savonarola and the Medici could not be starker. Where the Medici built, Savonarola burned. Where the Medici patronized art, Savonarola destroyed it. Where the Medici accommodated human weakness, Savonarola demanded impossible virtue. And yet, in a strange way, both represented authentic threads in the human experience, the desire to create beauty and the desire to purify, the love of this world and the longing for transcendence. Florence contained both impulses, and for a few dramatic years the destructive urge won out. Then the pendulum swung back, and the city resumed its role as the workshop of Renaissance civilization. The Medici would learn from this experience. When they returned to power, they would be less subtle about maintaining control, more willing to use force as well as patronage, more focused on securing their position against any future Savonarolas who might arise. The age of shadow government was ending, the age of princely rule was beginning. But that transformation would be shaped by the memory of those years when a single friar had turned Florence upside down, when the crowds had cheered as masterpieces burned, and when the city had discovered just how quickly everything it had built could be reduced to ash. The Medici returned to Florence in 1512, riding on the coattails of Spanish armies and papal diplomacy. The republic that had expelled them in 1494 and burned Savonarola in 1498 had proven unable to maintain itself against the great powers reshaping Italy. But the family that came back was different from the one that had left. They had learned from their exile, and they had found a new path to power, one that would take them far beyond Florence, all the way to the throne of St. Peter himself. In the 16th century, no fewer than 4 members of the Medici family would wear the papal tiara, making them arguably the most successful ecclesiastical dynasty in Catholic history. And in the process, they would accidentally help shatter the religious unity of Western Christendom. Not bad for a family of former bankers. The first and most consequential of the Medici popes was Giovanni de' Medici, the second son of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Giovanni had been groomed for a church career from childhood, a common practice among wealthy Italian families who saw ecclesiastical positions as valuable assets to be distributed among sons who wouldn't inherit the main family business. Lorenzo had used every connection he possessed to advance Giovanni's career, securing him a cardinal's hat at the absurdly young age of 13. The appointment was kept secret for 3 years to avoid scandal, but by 1492, when Lorenzo died, Giovanni was already positioned for greatness within the church hierarchy. Giovanni spent the years of Medici exile cultivating relationships in Rome, building the networks that would eventually make him pope. He was present at the conclave of 1503 that elected Julius II, the warrior pope who would commission Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling and launch ambitious military campaigns to expand papal territory. Giovanni learned from Julius's example, both what to do and what not to do, and when Julius died in 1513, Giovanni was ready to make his move. The conclave that elected Giovanni as Pope Leo X was remarkably swift by papal standards. Just 2 days of deliberation before the cardinals settled on this plump, cultured, 37-year-old Florentine as the new vicar of Christ. Giovanni was reportedly suffering from a painful fistula at the time and had to be carried into the conclave on a stretcher, which gives you some sense of the physical realities underlying the spiritual grandeur of papal politics. His election was celebrated in Florence with bonfires, processions, and general rejoicing. The Medici had finally reached the summit of European power, and their hometown was eager to share in the reflected glory. Leo X would become famous, or perhaps infamous, for a remark he allegedly made upon his election. "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." Whether he actually said this is debated, but it captures something true about his approach to the office. Leo was a Renaissance prince who happened to be pope, not a spiritual leader who happened to live during the Renaissance. He loved art, music, literature, hunting, elaborate banquets, and all the refined pleasures that his Medici upbringing had taught him to appreciate. He was also, by most accounts, a genuinely decent person, affable, generous, loyal to friends, and not particularly vindictive toward enemies. These were admirable qualities in a human being, but they didn't necessarily translate into effective leadership of a church facing unprecedented challenges. The papal court under Leo X became a spectacular showcase of Renaissance culture. Artists, poets, musicians, and scholars flocked to Rome seeking patronage, and Leo was happy to provide it. Raphael continued working on his frescoes in the Vatican apartments, producing images of such beauty that pilgrims sometimes forgot they were supposed to be praying. New construction projects transformed the city. Theatrical performances, musical concerts, and literary gatherings filled the papal calendar. Rome under Leo X was, by all accounts, a wonderful place to be if you were talented, connected, and enjoyed good parties. It was less wonderful if you were a devout Christian concerned about the state of the church. Leo's personal pleasures were legendary even by Renaissance papal standards. He maintained a menagerie of exotic animals, including an elephant named Hanno given to him by the King of Portugal, which became a celebrity in Rome before dying in 1516 to widespread mourning. Leo organised elaborate hunting expeditions in the countryside around Rome, pursuing boar and deer with an enthusiasm that scandalised reformers who thought popes should have better things to do. He staged theatrical productions, some featuring rather risky content that wouldn't have been out of place in a Florentine carnival. He was a genuine connoisseur of music and employed some of the finest composers and performers in Europe. The costs of maintaining this lifestyle were staggering. Leo reportedly went through the entire papal treasury inherited from Julius II within 2 years of his election. No small feat, since Julius had left substantial reserves. New revenues were constantly needed, and Leo's financial advisors scrambled to find them. They sold offices, borrowed from bankers at ruinous interest rates, and exploited every possible ecclesiastical revenue stream. The papal court became notorious for corruption, with everything from bishoprics to judicial decisions available for purchase if you could afford the price. The problem was money. Leo spent lavishly on art, on building projects, on maintaining his court, on diplomatic ventures, on supporting his Medici relatives back in Florence, and the papal treasury couldn't keep up. The papacy had various revenue streams: taxes from the papal states, fees for ecclesiastical appointments, contributions from Catholic monarchs, and assorted other sources. But none of these were sufficient for Leo's appetites. He needed new money, and he found it in a practice that would prove catastrophically controversial: the sale of indulgences. Indulgences require some explanation for modern audiences, because the theology behind them is genuinely complicated. In Catholic doctrine, sin creates 2 problems: guilt and punishment. Confession and absolution remove the guilt. Your soul is forgiven. But temporal punishment may still be required, either in this life or in purgatory after death. An indulgence was a formal reduction of this temporal punishment, granted by the Church based on its spiritual authority. You could earn indulgences through pious acts, prayer, pilgrimage, charitable giving. The idea wasn't that you were buying your way into heaven. That would be simony, a serious sin, but rather that you were performing meritorious actions that the Church rewarded with spiritual benefits. In practice, however, the distinction between earning and buying indulgences had become somewhat blurred. By Leo's time, indulgences were being marketed aggressively, with professional salesmen travelling across Europe offering them in exchange for cash contributions. The money raised was supposed to fund worthy causes, in this case the reconstruction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, one of the most ambitious building projects in history. The old Constantinian basilica was being demolished and replaced with a magnificent new church designed by the greatest architects of the age. This was an enormously expensive undertaking, and indulgence sales were one of the primary funding mechanisms. The most notorious of the indulgence salesmen was Johann Tetzel, a Dominican friar whose marketing techniques would have impressed a modern infomercial host. Tetzel travelled through Germany with an entourage, setting up in town squares and preaching sermons designed to maximize contributions. He reportedly used the slogan, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs," a catchy jingle that reduced complex theology to a simple commercial transaction. Whether Tetzel actually said this exact phrase is debated, but the sentiment captured what many people believed was happening. The church was selling salvation for cash. Tetzel's sales pitches were carefully calibrated to different audiences. For wealthy patrons, he offered indulgences that could release deceased relatives from purgatory, a powerful appeal to family loyalty and grief. For common folk, he emphasized the terror of purgatorial punishment and the ease with which it could be avoided. He carried elaborate charts showing the prices for different levels of sin. Murder required a higher payment than theft, for instance. The whole operation had the atmosphere of a medieval QVC, complete with high-pressure tactics and limited-time offers. The system worked well enough in Italy and other Catholic heartlands, where people accepted the Church's authority to grant such spiritual benefits. But in Germany, it encountered a problem in the form of a young Augustinian monk named Martin Luther. Luther was troubled by what he saw in the indulgence trade. Not just the crude commercialism of the salesman, who promised that souls would fly out of purgatory the moment coins dropped into their collection boxes, but the underlying theology that made such claims possible. If salvation depended on good works, including the good work of contributing to church construction, then what happened to people who couldn't afford to pay? Was God's grace available only to those with money? Luther's theological concerns led him to compose 95 theses, propositions for academic debate, that challenged various aspects of indulgence theology. On October 31st, 1517, he reportedly posted these theses on the door of the castle church in Wittenberg, a common method for announcing topics for scholarly discussion. Luther probably expected a relatively contained academic argument. What he got was a continental firestorm. The printing press, a relatively new technology that the Church had initially welcomed as a tool for spreading Christian literature, now became an engine of dissent. Luther's theses were translated from Latin into German, printed in multiple editions, and distributed across the Holy Roman Empire within weeks. People who had never heard of Martin Luther were suddenly reading his criticisms of papal practices and nodding in recognition. Yes, they had noticed that the indulgence sellers seemed more interested in money than souls. Yes, they had wondered why the Pope needed German coins to build his Italian church. Yes, they had questions about whether this was really what Jesus had in mind. Leo X initially dismissed the controversy as a quarrel among monks. The Augustinians and Dominicans had long-standing rivalries, and the indulgence trade was dominated by Dominicans. Surely this Luther person would be silenced by his superiors and the whole thing would blow over. This assessment proved, shall we say, optimistic. Luther was not interested in being silenced. He was interested in reforming the Church, and when the Church proved unwilling to be reformed, he was interested in challenging its fundamental authority. The theological debate escalated rapidly. Luther moved from criticizing indulgences to questioning purgatory, papal authority, and eventually the entire system of salvation through works that underpinned Catholic practice. He articulated a vision of Christianity centered on Scripture alone, faith alone, and grace alone, a radical simplification that appealed to people frustrated with the complexity and apparent corruption of the institutional Church. The Pope was not the Vicar of Christ, Luther argued, but potentially the Antichrist, leading Christians astray with false teachings. This was not the kind of criticism that could be resolved through academic debate. Leo responded with a papal bull, Exsurge Domine, issued in June 1520, that condemned 41 of Luther's propositions and gave him 60 days to recant or face excommunication. Luther's response was theatrical. He publicly burned the papal bull along with copies of canon law, declaring that if the Pope treated his writings as worthy of fire, he would return the favour. This act of defiance electrified Germany and made clear that the controversy had moved beyond theological disputation into open rebellion against papal authority. The final break came in January 1521, when Leo formally excommunicated Luther from the Catholic Church. By this point, however, Luther had powerful political protectors, German princes who saw in his movement an opportunity to resist papal influence and perhaps seize church properties. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V summoned Luther to the Diet of Worms to answer for his teachings, but the monk refused to recant. "Here I stand, I can do no other," he supposedly declared, though the exact words are probably apocryphal. What's not apocryphal is that Luther left Worms a free man, protected by his princely supporters, and continued spreading his teachings while the church that had excommunicated him proved unable to stop him. Leo X died in December 1521, possibly of malaria, possibly of other causes. The medical records are unclear. He was only 46 years old and had been pope for just over 8 years. In that time, he had presided over the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, a religious revolution that would split Western Christianity permanently and trigger over a century of religious warfare. This was not what Leo had intended. He had wanted to be a patron of arts and culture, to complete St. Peter's Basilica, to enjoy the papacy that God had given him. Instead, he became the pope who lost half of Europe. It's tempting to blame Leo personally for the Reformation, and certainly his decisions contributed to the disaster. The aggressive indulgence campaign, the initial dismissal of Luther's concerns, the slow and inadequate response as the movement gained momentum, all of these were mistakes that a more astute pope might have avoided. But it's also true that the conditions for religious revolt had been building for decades before Leo took office. The Renaissance papacy had accumulated centuries of criticism for corruption, worldliness, and spiritual neglect. Calls for reform had been ignored or suppressed. The printing press had created new possibilities for spreading dissent that the Church's traditional tools of control couldn't handle. Leo was the pope when the dam burst, but the dam had been crumbling for generations. The papacy passed through 2 non-Medici holders, Adrian VI, a Dutch reformer who died after less than 2 years, and then back to Medici hands with Clement VII, elected in 1523. Giulio de' Medici, as Clement had been known before his elevation, was the illegitimate son of Lorenzo the Magnificent's murdered brother Giuliano, the same Giuliano who had been stabbed to death in the cathedral during the Pazzi conspiracy. Giulio had been raised by Lorenzo alongside his legitimate children, educated in the humanist tradition, and groomed for church service. He had served as de facto papal secretary under his cousin Leo X, and was considered one of the most capable administrators in Rome. His election as Pope Clement VII was expected to bring steady, competent leadership to a church in crisis. Unfortunately, competence in administration doesn't always translate into success in navigating impossible situations, and Clement VII inherited one of the most impossible situations in papal history. The Reformation was spreading across Germany and beginning to take hold in other regions. The great powers of Europe, France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire, were locked in struggle for control of Italy, and the Pope was caught in the middle. Clement tried to play the powers against each other, shifting alliances between Francis I of France and Emperor Charles V, hoping to preserve papal independence. This strategy proved disastrous. In 1527, the emperor's patience with papal manoeuvring ran out. Charles V unleashed an army on Italy, a motley force of Spanish soldiers, German landsknechts, and Italian mercenaries, many of whom had not been paid in months and were eager for plunder. The army's commander, the Duke of Bourbon, was killed early in the assault, leaving the troops without effective leadership and free to follow their worst instincts. This army marched on Rome with murderous intent, and on May 6, 1527, they breached the city's walls. What followed was one of the most traumatic events in Roman history since the sack by the Visigoths in 410 CE. The sack of Rome lasted for months. Imperial soldiers rampaged through the city, looting churches, monasteries, and private homes. Priceless artworks were destroyed or stolen. Libraries containing irreplaceable manuscripts were burned for warmth or simply out of vandalistic impulse. The tombs of popes were broken open and robbed of whatever valuables they contained. Relics that had been venerated for centuries were scattered or destroyed. German landsknechts, many of whom were Lutheran sympathizers, took particular pleasure in mocking Catholic practices. They dressed in cardinals' robes, performed parodies of Mass, and forced priests to commit sacrilege at sword point. The treatment of Rome's population was horrific, even by the brutal standards of 16th century warfare. Nuns were raped in their convents, priests were tortured for information about hidden treasures. Wealthy citizens were held for ransom, often tortured to increase the amounts their families would pay. The sick and elderly were killed rather than burdened with. Contemporary accounts describe corpses piling up in the streets, the smell of death pervading the city, and survivors wandering in shock through the ruins of their world. Contemporary estimates of the death toll range from several thousand to tens of thousands, and even the lower figures represent catastrophic violence. The cultural and psychological damage was incalculable. Rome in 1527 was not just any city. It was the centre of Western Christianity, the seat of St. Peter's successors, the repository of centuries of Christian art and learning. Its violation by Christian soldiers seemed to many observers like a sign of God's judgment on a corrupt church. Lutheran pamphleteers in Germany celebrated the sack as divine punishment for papal sins. Catholics struggled to understand how God could have permitted such horror. The trauma echoed through European culture for generations. Pope Clement VII spent the sack cowering in Castel Sant'Angelo, the fortress that had once been the Emperor Hadrian's mausoleum. He watched from its battlements as his city burned, as the soldiers of a Catholic emperor desecrated the holiest sites in Christendom. It was a humiliation almost beyond description. The vicar of Christ reduced to a prisoner in his own capital, unable to protect his flock from Christian soldiers, nominally under the authority of a Christian ruler. Clement remained besieged for months before negotiating his release, and even then he remained effectively a prisoner of imperial power. The sack of Rome had consequences far beyond Italy. It demonstrated that the papacy was now just another piece on the European chessboard, vulnerable to coercion by secular powers. It shattered the Renaissance confidence in cultural progress and civilized values. If Rome could be sacked, what was safe? And it left Clement VII weakened and desperate, in no position to resist pressure from the great powers on any issue that mattered to them. This proved catastrophic when King Henry VIII of England decided he wanted an annulment of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Henry's situation was, from his perspective, simple. Catherine had failed to produce a male heir, and Henry needed a son to secure the Tudor succession. He had fallen in love with Anne Boleyn, a lady-in-waiting who refused to become his mistress, and he wanted to marry her instead. The only obstacle was his existing marriage to Catherine, which he now claimed was invalid because Catherine had previously been briefly married to his older brother Arthur. According to biblical law, Henry argued, marrying your brother's widow was forbidden, and the papal dispensation that had permitted the marriage was therefore void. Under normal circumstances, the Pope might have found a way to accommodate Henry's request. Annulments for political reasons were not unknown in church history, and Henry was a valuable ally who had even written a defense of Catholic doctrine against Luther, earning him the title Defender of the Faith from Leo X. But circumstances were not normal. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, the same Charles whose armies had just sacked Rome and held Clement effectively prisoner. Granting Henry's annulment would enrage the emperor, and Clement was in no position to enrage the emperor about anything. The case dragged on for years. Clement stalled, appointed commissions, requested additional documentation, suggested compromises, and generally did everything possible to avoid making a decision. Henry grew increasingly impatient. His advisers, particularly Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, began suggesting that perhaps the king didn't need papal permission after all. Perhaps England could simply handle its own religious affairs, with the king as supreme head of the English Church. This idea, which would have seemed radical just a few years earlier, now appeared increasingly attractive. In 1533, Henry lost patience entirely. He married Anne Boleyn secretly, had his marriage to Catherine declared invalid by an English church court under Cranmer's direction, and broke definitively with Rome. The Pope responded with excommunication, but by this point Henry didn't care. The English Reformation proceeded rapidly. Monasteries were dissolved, their properties seized by the crown, and a new religious settlement was imposed that made the king, not the Pope, the supreme authority over the Church in England. Centuries of English Catholicism ended because a Medici Pope couldn't say yes to an annulment without angering the man who held him hostage. Clement VII died in 1534, exhausted and broken by the catastrophes of his pontificate. He had presided over the sack of Rome, the loss of England, the continued spread of Protestantism across northern Europe, and the effective end of papal political independence. His tomb in Rome bears no particular marks of distinction. You might walk past it without realizing you were looking at the resting place of one of history's most consequential popes, consequential mainly for what he failed to prevent. The third Medici pope came a generation later. Giovanni Angelo de' Medici was elected as Pope Pius IV in 1559, during a period when the Catholic Church was finally beginning to organize a coherent response to the Protestant challenge. Pius IV was not from the main Florentine branch of the Medici family. His ancestors were Milanese, possibly unrelated to the famous banking dynasty despite sharing the surname. But he had risen through the church hierarchy with Medici support, and his election was seen as another Medici triumph. Pius IV's great achievement was reconvening and concluding the Council of Trent, the most important Catholic assembly since the medieval ecumenical councils. The Council of Trent had been meeting on and off since 1545, attempting to address Protestant criticisms and reform Catholic practices. Previous sessions had made some progress but had been repeatedly disrupted by war, plague, and political interference. Pius IV managed to push through a final session that completed the Council's work and defined Catholic doctrine for centuries to come. The Tridentine reforms, as they became known, represented a comprehensive response to Protestant challenges. The Council clarified Catholic teaching on justification, sacraments, scripture, tradition, and other disputed points, firmly rejecting Protestant positions while also addressing legitimate criticisms of church practice. It established seminaries for the proper training of priests, standardized the liturgy, and created mechanisms for better discipline and supervision of clergy. The Counter-Reformation that emerged from Trent was a revitalized Catholicism, more disciplined, more clearly defined, and more militant in defending its position against Protestant advance. Pius IV died in 1565, having accomplished more for Catholic recovery than either of his Medici predecessors. He was succeeded by his cousin, who took the name Pius V and would later be canonized as a saint, evidence that the reforming spirit of Trent could produce genuinely holy leaders. The church that emerged from this era was changed, perhaps not in ways that the Renaissance popes would have recognized or approved, but changed in ways that allowed Catholicism to survive and eventually thrive in a divided Christian world. The fourth and final Medici pope was Leo XI, elected in April 1605. His pontificate was the shortest of the four, just 27 days before he died, probably of a cold contracted during the lengthy ceremonies of his coronation. Leo XI barely had time to do anything at all, making him the answer to a trivia question rather than a significant historical figure. Still, his brief reign represented a final Medici moment on the papal throne, a last hurrah for a family that had once seemed destined to dominate European affairs indefinitely. Looking at the Medici popes collectively, what do we see? We see a family that reached the highest position in Catholic Christendom, the most prestigious office in the Western world, and used it, imperfectly, to say the least. Leo X was cultured, generous, and catastrophically naive about the religious forces he was unleashing. Clement VII was intelligent, capable, and crushed by circumstances beyond his control. Pius IV was practical, administrative, and effective in ways his predecessors hadn't been. Leo XI was dead before we could learn anything much about him. Taken together, they embody the contradictions of the Renaissance Church, magnificent in its cultural achievements, compromised in its spiritual mission, and ultimately transformed by challenges it couldn't suppress. The irony is thick. The Medici had spent generations cultivating papal connections, and when they finally reached the papacy themselves, they presided over the worst disasters in church history since the Great Schism. Their indulgences funded the building of St. Peter's Basilica, still one of the world's most magnificent buildings, but they also funded Martin Luther's revolution. Their diplomatic manoeuvring failed spectacularly, leaving Rome sacked and England lost. Their cultural patronage produced glorious art but distracted from spiritual duties that might have prevented or at least mitigated the Protestant revolt. And yet, there's another way to look at this. The Medici popes were products of their time, acting within constraints they hadn't created and couldn't escape. The Renaissance papacy was a political institution as much as a spiritual one, and it was governed by rules that prioritized wealth, power, and cultural display. Leo X couldn't have known that a German monk's academic complaints would mushroom into continental revolution. Clement VII couldn't have anticipated the sack of Rome, or found a way to satisfy both Henry VIII and Charles V simultaneously. They made mistakes, certainly, but they were also swept along by forces larger than themselves. The Protestant Reformation would have happened with or without the Medici popes, though perhaps in different forms and on different timelines. The pressures that produced Luther lay frustration with clerical corruption, nationalist resentment of Roman extraction, theological questioning enabled by humanist scholarship and amplified by printing technology, had been building for decades. Some spark would have ignited the powder eventually. The Medici had the misfortune to be holding the matches when the explosion came. What the Medici popes ultimately demonstrate is the limits of worldly power, even at its most exalted. The papacy was the ultimate prize for ambitious families, the position that combined spiritual authority with political influence and cultural prestige. The Medici reached that prize multiple times and discovered that it couldn't protect them from history. They could commission masterpieces and host magnificent courts, but they couldn't stop ideas from spreading or armies from marching or kings from making their own religious choices. The throne of St. Peter turned out to be a very uncomfortable seat during the 16th century, and the Medici discovered this the hard way. As we reflect on this chapter of Medici history, consider the strange paths that power takes. A banking family from Florence, descended from village healers, produced popes who shaped, or failed to shape, the religious destiny of Europe. Their names are inscribed in the roll of pontiffs, their tombs lie in Roman churches, their decisions echoed through centuries of religious conflict. They reached the heights and found the heights treacherous. The family that had mastered the art of invisible power in Florence discovered that there was no invisibility on the papal throne. Every decision was scrutinized, every failure amplified, every scandal reported across a continent newly connected by printing presses and hungry for news. The church that emerged from the 16th century was not the church the Medici had known. It was harder, more disciplined, more clearly defined in its doctrines and more hostile to the kind of worldly Renaissance culture the family had loved. The Counter-Reformation Catholics who fought Protestants across Europe had little patience for the elegant compromises and aesthetic indulgences that Leo X had enjoyed. A new era was beginning, one in which the Medici would have to find new ways to maintain their relevance, as dukes, as grand dukes, as patrons of science rather than just art. The papal adventure was over, having produced more complications than triumphs. But the family would endure as it always had, adapting to changed circumstances and finding new paths to influence. The former healers had proved unable to heal the church's wounds, but they would continue treating the symptoms for another 2 centuries, until genetics finally accomplished what politics and religion could not. The Medici had conquered banking, mastered republican politics, and captured the papal throne. But there remained one summit of European power they had not yet reached: royalty itself. Despite all their wealth and influence, despite their popes and their palaces, the Medici remained what they had always been: commoners. Their blood was red, not blue. Their ancestors had mixed potions in village clinics, not commanded armies from ancestral castles. In a world where birth still mattered enormously, this was a limitation that no amount of money could entirely overcome. Or so it seemed, until the Medici discovered an alternative path. If you cannot be born royal, you can marry royal, and if you marry strategically enough, your descendants will sit on thrones throughout Europe. The architect of this final Medici transformation was Pope Clement VII, the same unfortunate pontiff who had witnessed the sack of Rome and lost England to Protestantism. Clement had one bright spot in his troubled pontificate. His young relative Catherine de' Medici, the daughter of Lorenzo de' Medici, Duke of Urbino, and a French princess named Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne. Catherine had been orphaned almost immediately. Her mother died of puerperal fever 2 weeks after giving birth, and her father followed a few days later, probably of syphilis or tuberculosis. The infant Catherine was suddenly both an orphan and an heiress, a valuable property to be managed by her Medici relatives. Catherine's childhood was turbulent even by Renaissance Italian standards. She was shuttled between relatives, caught up in the political chaos that followed the sack of Rome, and at one point held hostage in Florence during a siege when the city briefly expelled the Medici and reinstated republican government. According to some accounts, the besieging army suggested using the young Catherine as a human shield on the city walls, or placing her in a brothel to destroy her marriage value. Whether these threats were serious or merely rhetorical, they give some indication of the dangers facing a valuable political pawn in 16th century Italy. Catherine survived. She was nothing if not a survivor, and emerged from her childhood with a wariness and political acumen that would serve her well in the dangerous decades ahead. Pope Clement saw in Catherine an opportunity to achieve what generations of Medici had dreamed of: a marriage alliance with one of Europe's great royal houses. The candidate he identified was Henry, Duke of Orléans, the second son of King Francis I of France. Henry was not heir to the throne. His older brother Francis was the Dauphin, but he was still a prince of the blood, and marriage to him would elevate the Medici to a level of prestige they had never before achieved. The negotiations were complex, involving discussions of dowry, political alliances, and the eternal chess game of European diplomacy. Clement sweetened the deal with promises of territorial concessions in Italy and the substantial cash that the Medici could always provide. In 1533, the marriage was celebrated in Marseille, with the Pope himself officiating. Catherine was 14 years old, Henry was also 14, and notably unenthusiastic about his Italian bride. He was already in love with Diane de Poitiers, a woman nearly 20 years his senior who would remain his mistress for the rest of his life. Catherine, with her plain face, her foreign accent and her merchant family origins, could not compete with the elegant, sophisticated Diane. From the beginning, Catherine's marriage was a source of humiliation. She was legally Henry's wife, but Diane was the woman he loved, the woman he consulted on matters of state, the woman whose initials he intertwined with his own on royal buildings. Catherine endured this situation with outward patience, biding her time and bearing children when Henry could be persuaded to do his dynastic duty. The marriage almost ended in disaster when Catherine failed to produce children for the first 10 years. In a royal marriage, fertility was the primary obligation. Queens existed to produce heirs, and a barren queen was a useless queen. There was serious talk of annulment, of sending Catherine back to Italy and finding Henry a more productive wife. Catherine survived this crisis through a combination of luck, medical intervention, and sheer determination. She consulted doctors, experimented with treatments, and allegedly spied on Henry and Diane through a hole drilled in the floor above their bedroom to learn techniques that might help her conceive. Whatever she did, it worked. Starting in 1544, Catherine began producing children at an impressive rate, 10 in total, of whom 7 survived infancy. 3 of those surviving children would become kings of France. The unexpected death of Henry's older brother in 1536 suddenly made Henry the heir to the throne, and Catherine's position transformed accordingly. She was no longer merely a princess by marriage, she was the future Queen of France. When Francis I died in 1547, Henry became King Henry II, and Catherine became Queen Consort. She remained in the shadow of Diane de Poitiers, who continued to dominate Henry's affections and exercise substantial political influence. But Catherine was now officially one of the most important women in Europe. The banker's daughter from Florence had reached a throne, and she would fight to keep her family on it for the next 4 decades. Henry II's reign ended abruptly in 1559, when he was killed in a jousting accident. A lance splinter pierced his eye and lodged in his brain, leading to an agonizing death over 10 days. Catherine was devastated, but she was also liberated. Diane de Poitiers was banished from court immediately, forced to surrender the jewels and properties Henry had lavished on her, and sent to spend her remaining years in provincial obscurity. Catherine's long humiliation was over, and now she held power in her own right, as regent for her 15-year-old son, the new King Francis II. Francis II's reign lasted barely a year and a half before he died of an ear infection that spread to his brain. Not an uncommon fate in an era before antibiotics, when even minor infections could prove fatal. Catherine's second son, Charles, became King Charles IX at age 10, and Catherine continued as regent, now more securely in control than ever. She would dominate French politics for the next decade, navigating the increasingly dangerous waters of religious conflict that were tearing the kingdom apart. France in the mid-16th century was a powder keg of religious tension. The Protestant Reformation had gained substantial ground, and a significant minority of French people, perhaps 10% of the population, concentrated among the nobility and urban middle classes, had converted to Calvinism. These French Protestants were called Huguenots, and they represented both a spiritual challenge to Catholic orthodoxy and a political challenge to royal authority. The great noble families were divided. Some remained Catholic, others became Protestant, and the religious split overlaid older factional rivalries to create a combustible mixture. Catherine's approach to this crisis was pragmatic rather than ideological. She was Catholic by upbringing and inclination, but she was not a zealot. She had seen too much religious violence in Italy, had lived through too many reversals of fortune, to believe that any cause was worth destroying the kingdom over. Her goal was to preserve the monarchy and the Valois dynasty, her dynasty now, and she was willing to make compromises with Protestants if that served dynastic interests. This moderation won her enemies on both sides. Catholics thought she was too soft on heresy, while Protestants never fully trusted her. The religious conflicts that became known as the French Wars of Religion began in 1562, and would continue, with intervals of uneasy peace, for more than 30 years. Catherine worked constantly to broker compromises, arrange truces, and prevent either side from gaining decisive advantage. She issued edicts of toleration that granted Protestants limited rights, then rescinded them under Catholic pressure, then issued new edicts when Protestant forces won victories. It was an exhausting balancing act, and it satisfied no one, but it kept France from falling apart entirely, at least for a while. Catherine's marriage diplomacy continued during these turbulent years. She arranged matches for her children with strategic precision, seeking alliances that would strengthen the crown's position. Her daughter Elizabeth married Philip II of Spain, the most powerful Catholic monarch in Europe. Her daughter Claude married the Duke of Lorraine, securing that strategic border territory. Her daughter Margaret, the famous Queen Margot, was betrothed to Henry of Navarre, the young leader of the Protestant faction, and heir to the small but strategically important Kingdom of Navarre. This last marriage was particularly significant. It was supposed to heal the religious divide, uniting Catholic and Protestant in a dynastic bond that would end the civil wars. The wedding of Margaret of Valois and Henry of Navarre took place in Paris on August 18, 1572. It was a spectacular affair, designed to showcase royal magnificence and signal a new era of peace. Thousands of Huguenot nobles had travelled to Paris for the celebration, filling the city with Protestants who normally avoided the Catholic capital. Catherine and Charles IX had promised safe conduct, and the wedding festivities proceeded amid an atmosphere of cautious optimism. Perhaps the wars were really over. Perhaps Catholics and Protestants could coexist after all. What happened next remains one of the most controversial and horrifying episodes in French history. 5 days after the wedding, in the early morning hours of August 24, 1572, the feast day of St. Bartholomew, Catholic forces launched a coordinated attack on Huguenot leaders gathered in Paris. The signal was given by the bells of the church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, ringing in the darkness before dawn. Armed bands of Catholics, wearing white crosses on their hats and white armbands to identify themselves to each other, moved through the streets with lists of Protestant addresses. The primary target was Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the most respected Huguenot military commander who had already survived an assassination attempt 2 days earlier. Catholic soldiers broke into his lodgings, murdered him, and threw his body from the window. According to some accounts, the Duke of Guise, leader of the ultra-Catholic faction, kicked the corpse and verified the kill personally. Coligny's body was subsequently mutilated by the mob, castrated, dragged through the streets, and eventually hung by the feet from a gallows. The treatment of this distinguished nobleman, a man who had served France honourably in multiple wars, set the tone for what followed. The violence began with targeted assassinations of Protestant nobles, but quickly spiralled into a general massacre as Parisian mobs joined in, slaughtering Huguenots throughout the city. The killing acquired its own momentum, driven by religious hatred, greed for plunder, and the settling of personal scores that had nothing to do with theology. Neighbours turned on neighbours. Business rivals took the opportunity to eliminate competition. Creditors were killed by debtors who no longer wished to repay their loans. The chaos became total, with Catholics running through the streets shouting, "Kill! Kill! And God wills it," Crusader slogans repurposed for domestic slaughter. The River Seine ran red with blood, or so contemporary accounts claimed, probably an exaggeration, but one that captures the scale of the horror. Bodies were thrown into the water in such numbers that fishing downstream was reportedly affected for weeks. Some victims were killed in their homes, others were dragged into the streets for public execution. Women and children were not spared. Pregnant women had their bellies cut open. Babies were thrown against walls. The massacre revealed depths of cruelty that shocked even hardened contemporaries. The killing continued for 3 days in Paris and then spread to other cities across France over the following weeks. Estimates of the death toll vary wildly, from 5,000 to 30,000 or more, but even the conservative figures represent a bloodbath of extraordinary proportions, the Saint. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, as it became known, was not a spontaneous outburst of popular fury. It was planned, at least in its initial phase, by the Royal Council. The exact sequence of decisions that led to the massacre remains debated by historians, but Catherine de' Medici was almost certainly involved in authorising the initial assassinations, even if the subsequent mass killings exceeded what she had intended. The most common interpretation holds that Catherine and her son Charles IX approved the elimination of key Huguenot military leaders, a decapitation strike intended to prevent Protestant retaliation for an earlier assassination attempt on Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the most prominent Huguenot commander. When this targeted violence triggered wider killing, the royal authorities either lost control or chose not to restrain the Catholic mobs. Catherine's motivations have been analysed and debated for centuries. Was she acting from religious conviction, genuinely believing that heresy must be exterminated? The evidence suggests otherwise. She had shown too much willingness to compromise with Protestants over the years to be considered a true Catholic zealot. Was she acting from fear, believing that Huguenot leaders were planning a coup and striking first? This interpretation has some support in contemporary sources, which describe rumours of Protestant plots circulating in the tense days before the massacre. Was she acting from cold political calculation, concluding that eliminating Huguenot leadership would end the civil wars on Catholic terms? This seems most consistent with her general approach to politics, though it would mean badly miscalculating the consequences. Whatever her intentions, the results were catastrophic. The massacre did not end the wars of religion, it intensified them. Protestants who had been willing to seek accommodation with the crown now saw the monarchy as irredeemably hostile. The remaining Huguenot forces retreated to their strongholds in southern France and fought with the desperation of people who believed they were fighting for survival. Catholic extremists, emboldened by the massacre, demanded even more aggressive action against heresy. The middle ground that Catherine had tried to occupy for a decade was burned away, leaving only polarization and mutual hatred. The international reaction was equally damaging. Protestant Europe was horrified. In England, Queen Elizabeth I wore mourning clothes to receive the French ambassador and delivered a pointed lecture on the duties of monarchs to protect their subjects. In the Netherlands, the massacre strengthened resistance to Spanish Catholic rule. In Germany, Protestant princes drew the obvious conclusions about Catholic trustworthiness. The image of France as a civilized kingdom was shattered, replaced by the image of Paris streets running with Protestant blood, while the Catholic king looked on approvingly. Even some Catholics were disturbed by the scale of the violence. The massacre had killed not just soldiers and nobles, but women, children, and ordinary people whose only crime was their religion. Bodies had been thrown into the Seine in such numbers that downstream communities complained about contaminated water. The systematic nature of the killing, the way Catholic neighbours had turned on Protestant neighbours, guided by lists of addresses and aided by the authorities, suggested something deeply wrong with French society. Pope Gregory XIII ordered celebrations in Rome and struck a commemorative medal, but not all Catholics shared his enthusiasm. The massacre had revealed capacities for cruelty that made thoughtful people uncomfortable, regardless of their religious loyalties. Catherine's son, Henry of Navarre, the Protestant bridegroom whose wedding had been the occasion for gathering so many victims in Paris, survived by quickly converting to Catholicism. His conversion was obviously coerced and universally understood to be insincere, but it kept him alive. He would later famously reconvert to Protestantism, then convert back to Catholicism again when he became heir to the French throne, reportedly remarking that Paris is worth a mass. His religious flexibility scandalized true believers on both sides, but demonstrated a pragmatism that would eventually make him one of France's most successful kings. Catherine continued to dominate French politics through the reigns of her remaining sons. Charles IX died in 1574, possibly haunted by guilt over the massacre. He reportedly suffered nightmares in which he saw the faces of his victims. Catherine's third son became King Henry III, and she remained his closest advisor until her death in 1589. Henry III's reign was even more turbulent than his brother's, marked by continuing religious wars, the rise of the Catholic League as a rival power centre, and eventually Henry's own assassination by a fanatical monk. With Henry III's death, the direct Valois line ended, and the throne passed to Henry of Navarre. Catherine's former son-in-law, the survivor of the massacre, now King Henry IV of France. The irony was exquisite. Catherine had spent her life trying to preserve Valois power, and her efforts had ultimately failed. Her sons had all died without legitimate heirs, and the dynasty she had schemed and suffered and killed to protect was extinct. But the Medici connection to the French throne was not broken. Henry IV, now ruling France, would eventually need a new wife. His marriage to Catherine's daughter Margaret had been annulled, and his choice fell on another Medici, Marie de Medici, a descendant of the cadet branch that had become Grand Dukes of Tuscany. Marie de' Medici married Henry IV in 1600, and the pattern of the previous century repeated itself in new forms. Like Catherine, Marie came to France as a wealthy Italian bride, bringing a massive dowry that the perpetually cash-strapped French crown desperately needed. Reportedly 600,000 écus in cash, plus the cancellation of substantial debts Henry owed to the Medici Bank. The French king had been reluctant to marry at all, preferring his longtime mistress Gabrielle d'Estrées. But Gabrielle's convenient death in 1599 and pressing financial needs pushed him toward the Florentine match. Like Catherine, Marie struggled for respect in a court that looked down on her merchant origins. Henry had married her for her money, not her person, and he made little effort to hide his preference for his various mistresses. Marie was forced to endure the presence of Henriette d'Entragues, the king's current favourite, who openly mocked the queen, and even bore Henry children who were acknowledged at court. The humiliation was familiar to any student of Catherine's experience with Diane de Poitiers. The Medici women, it seemed, were destined to play second fiddle to their husbands' lovers. But Marie persevered, producing the heir that France needed. Her son, the future Louis XIII, was born in 1601, and 5 more children followed in quick succession. Whatever Henry's feelings about his wife, he could not fault her fertility. The Bourbon dynasty was secured by Medici wombs, just as the Valois had been secured by Catherine's productivity. The family's reproductive capacity was perhaps their greatest diplomatic asset. Like Catherine, Marie would become regent after her husband's sudden death. Henry IV was assassinated by a Catholic fanatic named François Ravaillac in 1610, stabbed to death in his carriage while stuck in Paris traffic. The murder shocked France and left Marie as regent for their 9-year-old son Louis XIII. Unlike Catherine, however, Marie proved unequal to the political challenges of the regency. Marie's regency was less successful than Catherine's had been. She lacked Catherine's political acumen and relied too heavily on favourites, particularly the Italian adventurer Concino Concini and his wife Leonora Galigai. The French nobility resented being governed by a woman they considered a foreign interloper, surrounded by Italian advisers who did not understand or respect French traditions. Louis XIII eventually came of age, had Concini murdered, and exiled his mother from court. Marie spent much of her later life plotting against her son and attempting to regain power, a sad end for another Medici queen. But Marie's real importance lay in her children. Her son Louis XIII became king and continued the Bourbon dynasty, though his reign was dominated by the brilliant Cardinal Richelieu rather than by his mother. Her daughter Elizabeth married Philip IV of Spain, becoming queen of the most powerful empire on earth. Her daughter Christine married Victor Amadeus I of Savoy, extending Medici connections to the Italian peninsula. Most significantly for English-speaking audiences, her daughter Henrietta Maria married Charles I of England, the same Charles who would lose his head in the English Civil War, but whose children would return to rule as Charles II and James II. Through Henrietta Maria, Medici blood entered the British royal line and remains there to this day. Every British monarch since the Restoration has been a descendant of Marie de' Medici. When Elizabeth II sat on the throne of England, she was carrying the genetic inheritance of Florentine bankers who had started out mixing potions in Tuscan villages. The current royal family continues this line. The Medici have achieved a kind of biological immortality through the British crown. The mathematics of descent meant that Medici ancestry multiplied with each generation. Marie's grandchildren married into yet more royal houses, and their children married into others, creating an expanding web of Medici lineage that eventually touched virtually every throne in Europe. The Habsburgs, the Bourbons, the Braganzas, the Wittelsbachs all became connected through various lines to the Florentine dynasty. By the 18th century, finding European royalty without some trace of Medici ancestry would have required diligent genealogical research. Through these marriages, Medici blood entered every major royal house in Western Europe. By the 18th century, the descendants of Florentine bankers sat on thrones in France, Spain, Austria, and beyond. The Medici had finally achieved what money alone could never buy. They had become, through patient marriage diplomacy and statistical probability, genuine royalty. This transformation deserves reflection. The Medici had started as nobody, village healers in rural Tuscany, indistinguishable from thousands of other families scratching out livings in medieval Italy. Through banking, they had become rich. Through patronage and political manipulation, they had become powerful. Through papal connections, they had become respectable, and through marriage, they had become royal. Each step had taken generations of patient effort, strategic planning, and occasional ruthlessness. The family that emerged at the end of this process bore little resemblance to its origins, yet the ambition that drove it remained remarkably consistent across centuries. Catherine de' Medici remains the most complex and controversial figure in this saga. She was the first Medici to actually sit on a major throne. As Queen of France, she outranked even her papal relatives, and she exercised power more directly than any previous member of the family. She was also responsible for, or at least complicit in, one of the worst atrocities in early modern European history, the Saint. Bartholomew's Day massacre stained her reputation permanently, and she has been vilified by Protestant historians and lionized by Catholic apologists for centuries. The truth, as usual, is more complicated than either narrative allows. Catherine was neither the demonic Black Queen of Protestant propaganda, nor the saintly defender of Catholic France portrayed by her admirers. She was a politician, operating in a political environment of extraordinary danger, trying to preserve her family's position through whatever means seemed necessary. She made terrible decisions, including the decision, or at least the acquiescence, that led to the massacre. But she also prevented worse outcomes on other occasions, brokering compromises that kept France from total disintegration. She was ruthless because her world was ruthless, and she survived longer than almost anyone else in the brutal game of 16th century politics. Her marriage to Henry II had been a gamble by Pope Clement VII, an attempt to elevate the Medici through dynastic connection. The gamble paid off beyond anything Clement could have imagined. His young relative became mother and grandmother to kings, and Medici blood flowed into the veins of European royalty. But the price of that success was measured in corpses floating in the Seine, in decades of civil war, in a reputation that would never fully recover. The Medici had reached the summit of European power, but the view from the top included some very dark valleys. The marriage strategy perfected by Catherine and continued by Marie transformed the Medici from Italian power brokers into pan-European aristocracy. Their descendants would rule for centuries, and their genetic legacy persists in royal and noble families to this day. Walk through any portrait gallery of European royalty from the 17th century onward, and you are looking at people who carry Medici DNA, the biological inheritance of bankers and merchants who dreamed of something greater and found ways to achieve it. This genetic diffusion represents a kind of immortality that goes beyond monuments or memories. The Medici, who built palaces and commissioned paintings, left behind beautiful objects, but objects can be destroyed or forgotten. The Medici, who married strategically, left behind something more permanent: children and children's children, and an unbroken chain of descent that connects 21st century royalty to 15th century Florence. In the most literal possible sense, the Medici became part of European civilization's fabric, woven into the bloodlines that ruled the continent for hundreds of years. Was it worth it? The question is unanswerable, but it's worth asking. Catherine spent her life scheming, compromising, and occasionally killing to keep her family in power. She achieved remarkable success by the standards she cared about: 3 sons as kings, marriages connecting her children to the greatest houses of Europe, the permanent elevation of Medici status to royal rank. But she also presided over atrocities, endured endless humiliations, and watched most of her children die young. Her personal life was largely unhappy, spent in the shadow of her husband's mistress, and burdened by responsibilities that aged her before her time. The portrait of Catherine in her later years shows a heavy, tired woman dressed in perpetual mourning black, not the image of someone enjoying the fruits of success, and yet she persisted. That persistence is perhaps the most Medici quality of all. From Giovanni de' Medici building his bank in the 14th century to Catherine fighting for her sons in the 16th, the family displayed a relentless determination to rise, to survive, to push forward regardless of setbacks. They were knocked down repeatedly, exiled from Florence, bankrupted by bad loans, deprived of papal support, massacred by their enemies, and they kept coming back. Whatever else you say about the Medici, you cannot say they lacked tenacity. The dark legacy of Catherine and the massacre she authorized should not be minimized or excused. The Saint. Bartholomew's Day massacre was a crime by any standard, a deliberate slaughter of civilians that violated both Christian principles and basic human decency. That Catherine may have felt she had no choice, That she was protecting her family and her kingdom from perceived threats does not absolve her of responsibility for the deaths of thousands. History should remember her achievements, but it should also remember her victims, the men, women and children who died because a Medici queen decided that their deaths served her interests. The marriage strategy itself raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of power and the uses of human beings. Royal marriages in this era treated people as property, as assets to be deployed for strategic advantage. Catherine was sold to the French crown as a teenager, forced to endure a loveless marriage for decades, and valued primarily for her ability to produce children. She then did the same to her own children, arranging marriages based on political calculation rather than personal happiness. The system worked, in the sense that it achieved its goals, but it worked by treating people as means rather than ends, a corruption of humanity that the Medici pursued as deliberately as any other family of their era. As we near the end of the Medici story, consider what this chapter reveals about the family's trajectory. They had risen from nothing to everything, from village obscurity to European royalty. They had achieved this through banking, politics, religion, and finally marriage, a comprehensive strategy that exploited every available pathway to power. But the cost had been enormous, paid in blood and suffering and the souls of those who made the hardest decisions. The Medici had proved that a determined family could conquer the world, or at least the European parts of it. Whether that conquest was worth the price is a question that each generation must answer for itself. The blood of the Medici, once confined to Tuscan villages, now flowed through the veins of kings and queens across Europe. The family of healers had become the family of rulers, their genetic legacy spreading across the continent like the influence their ancestors had once spread through banking networks. It was the ultimate transformation, the final proof that money and ambition could overcome any barrier of birth or tradition. The Medici had bet everything on rising, and in the end they had won, even if winning sometimes looked an awful lot like tragedy. By the 17th century, the Medici were no longer the scrappy upstarts of Florentine finance. They had become, officially and finally, nobility, Grand Dukes of Tuscany since 1569, recognised by papal authority and settled into the comfortable routines of hereditary monarchy. The transformation was complete. The family that had once manipulated republics from behind the scenes now ruled openly from the Palazzo Pitti, wearing crowns and expecting deference. But this elevation came at a cost. Grand Dukes didn't innovate. They administered. They maintained. They presided over slow, dignified decline while pretending nothing had changed. The Medici of the 17th century were rich, titled, and increasingly irrelevant to the great events reshaping Europe. But the family had one more act to perform, one more contribution to make to human civilization. Having patronized art in the 15th century and shaped religion in the 16th, the Medici would turn their attention to science in the 17th. This final chapter of their patronage would prove as consequential as anything they had done before, helping to launch the scientific revolution that would transform the modern world. The family that had funded Brunelleschi's dome and Michelangelo's sculptures would now fund telescopes and thermometers, supporting investigators who challenged not just artistic conventions, but the fundamental structure of the universe itself. The central figure in this scientific chapter was Galileo Galilei, and his relationship with the Medici illustrates both the possibilities and the limits of princely patronage in an age of religious upheaval. Galileo was born in Pisa in 1564, the same year Michelangelo died, as though genius were being passed from one discipline to another. He showed early brilliance in mathematics and natural philosophy, and by his 30s he was one of the most celebrated scholars in Italy, holding a professorship at the University of Padua in the Republic of Venice. Galileo's connection to the Medici dated back to his youth. His father had been a court musician in Florence, and Galileo himself had tutored the young Cosimo de' Medici, the future Grand Duke Cosimo II, in mathematics during summer visits to Tuscany. This personal relationship would prove crucial to Galileo's career and ultimately to his fate. When Galileo sought to leave his Venetian position for something more prestigious and better paid, he naturally looked to his former student, now Grand Duke, as a potential patron. The opportunity came in 1610, when Galileo made the discoveries that would change astronomy forever. Using a telescope he had improved based on Dutch designs, he observed the moons of Jupiter, 4 small bodies orbiting the giant planet in clear defiance of the Earth-centered cosmology that had dominated Western thought for nearly 2,000 years. If Jupiter had moons, then not everything in the heavens revolved around Earth. The Aristotelian universe, with its crystal spheres and perfectly circular celestial motions, was in serious trouble. Galileo announced his discoveries in a short book called Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, and dedicated it to Cosimo II. More importantly, he named the 4 moons he had discovered the Medici stars after his patron's family. This was scientific flattery of the highest order. The Medici name was literally written in the heavens, attached to celestial bodies that would be observed and discussed as long as astronomy existed. Cosimo was delighted. Within months, Galileo had been appointed first philosopher and mathematician to the Grand Duke of Tuscany, with a generous salary and minimal teaching obligations. He could pursue his research full-time, funded by Medici wealth and protected by Medici prestige. The arrangement worked beautifully for over a decade. Galileo continued his astronomical observations, discovering the phases of Venus, the spots on the Sun, and the strange elongations of Saturn that he couldn't quite explain. They were rings, but his telescope wasn't powerful enough to resolve them. Clearly, he engaged in vigorous debates with conservative scholars who rejected his findings, and he generally won those debates through a combination of observational evidence and devastating rhetorical skill. Galileo was not a modest man. He had a gift for making enemies, and he used it frequently. But under Medici protection, his enemies could not touch him. The problem was that Galileo's discoveries had implications that went far beyond academic astronomy. If the Earth moved around the Sun, as Galileo increasingly believed and argued, then certain passages of scripture that seemed to describe the Sun moving across the sky would need to be reinterpreted. This was theologically delicate territory. The Catholic Church was in the midst of the Counter-Reformation, fighting Protestant challenges to its authority, and it was in no mood for additional complications. Questioning the literal truth of Scripture, even on scientific grounds, looked an awful lot like the kind of thing Protestants did. In 1616, the Church issued a formal warning. Heliocentrism, the theory that the Earth orbits the Sun, was declared foolish and absurd in philosophy, and formally heretical since it explicitly contradicts in many places the sense of Holy Scripture. Galileo was personally advised to abandon these opinion and not to hold, teach, or defend it. He agreed, more or less, and returned to his research on less controversial topics. But Galileo being Galileo, he couldn't leave it alone forever. The crisis came in 1632, when Galileo published his Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, a book that presented arguments for and against heliocentrism in the form of a conversation between 3 characters. The book was ostensibly neutral, presenting both sides of the debate. In practice, it was a devastating demolition of the Earth-centered cosmology, with the defender of Aristotelian physics portrayed as a simplistic buffoon named Simplicio. To make matters worse, Pope Urban VIII, who had once been friendly to Galileo, believed that some of his own arguments had been put in Simplicio's mouth, making him look foolish. The Pope was not amused. Galileo was summoned to Rome to face the Inquisition. This was serious. The Inquisition had real power. It could imprison, torture, and execute those it found guilty of heresy. Galileo was 70 years old, in poor health, and facing an institution that had burned Giordano Bruno alive for similar philosophical crimes just 3 decades earlier. The Medici, for all their power in Tuscany, could not directly challenge papal authority in Rome. Grand Duke Ferdinando II, Cosimo II's son, now ruling Tuscany, did what he could, providing comfortable lodgings for Galileo during the trial and using diplomatic channels to advocate for leniency. But he could not stop the proceedings. The trial itself was something of a formality. The Inquisition had already decided that Galileo had violated the 1616 warning by publishing the Dialogue. The question was what punishment he would receive. Under threat of torture, a threat that was probably not carried out given his age and status, Galileo formally abjured his belief in heliocentrism and affirmed that the Earth stood still at the centre of the universe. According to legend, as he rose from his knees after recanting, he muttered, "Eppur si muove," and yet it moves. This almost certainly didn't happen, but it captures something true about Galileo's spirit. He could be forced to say the words, but he couldn't be forced to believe them. Galileo was sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his life. The Inquisition initially wanted to confine him in Rome, but the Medici intervened, and he was allowed to serve his sentence at his villa in Arcetri, outside Florence. This was not a dungeon. It was a comfortable home where Galileo could continue his work under relatively mild restrictions. Grand Duke Ferdinando II visited him there, bringing gifts and conversation, maintaining the personal connection that linked scientist and patron despite the Church's disapproval. Galileo's final years were productive. He wrote his most important book on physics, The Two New Sciences, which was smuggled out of Italy and published in Protestant Holland where the Inquisition couldn't reach it. Galileo died in 1642, still under house arrest, still officially condemned by the Church. Ferdinando II wanted to erect a grand monument in his honour, but the Pope forbade it. Celebrating a convicted heretic would be inappropriate. The Medici respected this prohibition publicly while privately preserving Galileo's legacy. His papers, instruments, and relics were carefully maintained, and eventually, over a century later, a proper tomb was constructed in the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence. The Catholic Church finally admitted that Galileo had been right in 1992, only 350 years late, but who's counting? The Galileo affair illustrates the complexities of Medici patronage in the 17th century. The family genuinely supported scientific inquiry and did what they could to protect their intellectual clients from persecution, but their power had limits. They were Grand Dukes of a small Italian state, dependent on papal goodwill and unable to directly challenge church authority. They could provide comfortable house arrest instead of a Roman dungeon, but they couldn't overturn a verdict of the Holy Office. The Medici had once made popes, now they had to accommodate them. The scientific interests of Ferdinando II went far beyond his support for Galileo. He was himself an amateur scientist, genuinely fascinated by the new experimental methods that were transforming natural philosophy. He invented an improved thermometer, conducted experiments on the properties of various materials, and surrounded himself with scholars who shared his curiosity. His court became a centre for scientific discussion and investigation, attracting talented researchers from across Italy and beyond. In 1657, Ferdinando and his brother Leopold established the Accademia del Cimento, the Academy of Experiments, which has a strong claim to being the first scientific society in the modern sense. The Academy brought together researchers to conduct systematic experiments, share results, and subject findings to collective scrutiny. This was something new in the history of knowledge. Previous intellectual institutions had focused on preserving and transmitting received wisdom. The Academy of Experiments was dedicated to generating new knowledge through empirical investigation. The motto adopted by the Academy, provando e riprovando, roughly testing and retesting, captured this experimental spirit perfectly. The Academy's members included some of the leading scientific minds of the era. Francesco Redi conducted experiments that challenged the theory of spontaneous generation, showing that maggots appeared in meat only when flies had access to lay eggs. Giovanni Borelli studied animal locomotion and the mechanics of muscle movement. Vincenzo Viviani, a former student of Galileo's, worked on mathematics and physics. The Academy's experiments ranged across what we would now call physics, chemistry, biology, and meteorology. They studied air pressure, the behaviour of liquids, the transmission of sound, and dozens of other phenomena. The results of the Academy's work were published in 1667 in a volume called Saggi di Naturali Esperienze, Essays of Natural Experiments, which described their methods and findings in careful detail. This publication allowed the Academy's work to influence scientists across Europe, including the newly formed Royal Society in London and the French Academy of Sciences in Paris. The Medici had helped establish a template for how scientific investigation should be organised and conducted, a template that would prove enormously influential in the development of modern science. The Academy of Experiments lasted only a decade before disbanding in 1667, probably due to pressure from the Church, which remained suspicious of the new experimental philosophy. But its brief existence demonstrated that the Medici commitment to knowledge extended across the centuries and across the categories of human inquiry. In the 15th century, they had supported the recovery of ancient wisdom through humanist scholarship and the Platonic Academy. In the 16th century, they had navigated the dangerous waters of religious reformation and counter-reformation. In the 17th century, they had backed the emergence of modern experimental science, even when that science brought them into conflict with ecclesiastical authority. There was a continuity here that transcended the individual personalities involved. Generation after generation, the Medici had sought out the most innovative minds of their time and provided them with resources to pursue their work. Not every Medici was equally enlightened. Some were more interested in hunting than philosophy, but the family as a whole maintained a tradition of intellectual patronage that set them apart from most European aristocracies. They understood, perhaps intuitively, that knowledge was a form of power, and that supporting its advancement was an investment in their own legacy. Now we must turn to the final chapter, the ending that comes to all dynasties: extinction. The Medici had risen from obscurity, achieved remarkable heights, and spread their influence across Europe. But families, unlike institutions, are biological entities, and biology has its own imperatives. The Medici line, which had once been so prolific that there were branches for every occasion, began to thin in the 17th century. Marriages produced fewer children. Children died young. The great family tree that had spread across Europe began to wither at its Tuscan roots. The decline was gradual but unmistakable. Grand Duke Ferdinando II, patron of Galileo and founder of the Academy of Experiments, had multiple children, but only one son survived to adulthood. That son, Cosimo III, became Grand Duke in 1670 and ruled for an extraordinary 53 years, the longest reign in Medici history. But those 5 decades were marked more by stagnation than achievement. Cosimo III was pious to the point of fanaticism, obsessed with religious observance and moral regulation in ways that made Savonarola look relaxed. He banned books, restricted public entertainments, and imposed a suffocating atmosphere of religious conformity on Tuscany. His subjects, accustomed to the relative freedom of earlier Medici rule, found his reign oppressive and joyless. More problematically for the dynasty, Cosimo III's marriage was a disaster. His wife, Marguerite Louise of Orléans, was a French princess who hated Tuscany, hated her husband, and made no secret of either sentiment. Their marriage produced 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, but the relationship was so toxic that Marguerite Louise eventually returned to France permanently, leaving Cosimo to brood alone in Florence. The sons who would determine the fate of the dynasty grew up in this poisonous environment, and neither proved capable of continuing the family line. Ferdinando, the elder son and heir apparent, was cultured, intelligent, and by many accounts the most promising Medici of his generation. He was also ill, probably with syphilis contracted during the dissolute youth that Medici heirs seemed unable to avoid, and he died in 1713 without producing legitimate children. His younger brother, Gian Gastone, became the last hope for the dynasty's continuation. Gian Gastone had been married off to a German princess, Anna Maria Franziska of Saxe-Lauenburg, in a match that was unhappy from the start. Anna Maria was coarse, unattractive, and hostile to her Italian husband. Gian Gastone was depressive, alcoholic, and apparently more interested in men than women. The marriage produced no children, and after a few miserable years the couple separated permanently. When Cosimo III died in 1723, Gian Gastone became the last Medici Grand Duke. His reign was, to put it charitably, unedifying. He spent most of his time in bed, attended by a collection of young men known as the Ruspanti, who provided companionship of various sorts in exchange for small silver coins called ruspi. He drank heavily, ate excessively, and rarely appeared in public. When he did emerge from his bedchamber, he was often dishevelled and confused, a poor advertisement for Medici grandeur. Foreign visitors who expected to find the inheritors of Lorenzo the Magnificent were confronted instead with a bloated, drunk recluse who couldn't be bothered to dress properly for state occasions. The question of what would happen to Tuscany after Gian Gastone's death preoccupied European diplomats for years before that death actually occurred. The Grand Duchy was too valuable a territory to simply pass to the nearest relative. It would be absorbed into the complicated chess game of European power politics. After extensive negotiations, the great powers agreed that Tuscany would pass to Francis Stephen, Duke of Lorraine and future Holy Roman Emperor, in exchange for Lorraine being transferred to France. The Medici had no say in this arrangement. Their 300-year dominance of Florence would end not with a bang, but with a diplomatic footnote. Gian Gastone died on July 9, 1737, and with him died the male line of the Medici family. He was 66 years old and had been Grand Duke for 14 largely wasted years spent mostly in his bedchamber, surrounded by his Ruspanti and his wine bottles. His body was laid to rest in the Medici chapel, that extraordinary mausoleum where Michelangelo's sculptures guard the tombs of earlier family members. He joined Lorenzo the Magnificent and Cosimo the Elder, Giuliano and the various popes and cardinals and dukes who had carried the Medici name to heights their ancestors could never have imagined. And then the line was closed. No more Medici would rule in Florence. But the story was not quite finished. There remained one Medici, the last of the dynasty, Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, Giangaston's sister, the Electress Palatine by virtue of her marriage to a German prince. Anna Maria Luisa had returned to Florence as a widow, and she watched as her family's domain was handed over to foreigners. She could do nothing to prevent this political transfer, but she could do something about the cultural legacy, the art, the libraries, the scientific collections, the accumulated treasures of 3 centuries of Medici patronage. In 1737, Anna Maria Luisa signed a document known as the Patto di Famiglia, the Family Pact, with the new rulers of Tuscany. This agreement stipulated that all the Medici collections would remain in Florence permanently, for the benefit of the public and the ornament of the state. Nothing could be removed or sold. The Uffizi Gallery, the Pitti Palace, the libraries, the scientific instruments, the endless rooms full of paintings and sculptures and manuscripts, all of it would stay in Florence forever, available to visitors from around the world. This was an extraordinary act of generosity and foresight. Anna Maria Luisa could have demanded that the collections be divided, with portions going to relatives or to her German connections. She could have sold pieces to raise money for herself or her causes. She could have allowed the new rulers to do whatever they wanted with property they had acquired by treaty. Instead, she ensured that the Medici legacy would remain intact and accessible, a permanent gift to Florence and to humanity. The Patto di Famiglia is why you can visit the Uffizi today and see Botticelli's Birth of Venus and Primavera, Leonardo's Annunciation, Titian's Venus of Urbino, and hundreds of other masterpieces in their original home. It's why the Palazzo Pitti contains one of the world's great art collections, and why the Medici chapels display Michelangelo's sculpture in the setting for which it was designed. Anna Maria Luisa understood that her family's true legacy wasn't political power, that was already lost, but cultural achievement. By preserving and protecting that achievement, she gave the Medici a kind of immortality that transcends the biological extinction of their line. Anna Maria Luisa died in 1743, the last of the Medici. She was 75 years old and had outlived her entire family, watching her parents, her siblings, her husband, and her only child all precede her to the grave. Her death marked the absolute end of the dynasty that had dominated Florence for 3 centuries, but it also marked the beginning of their eternal life as symbols and legends. The legacy the Medici left behind extends far beyond the art collections, extraordinary as those are. They shaped the very city of Florence, building churches and palaces and libraries that define its character to this day. Brunelleschi's dome, financed partly by Medici money, remains the defining symbol of the city and one of the greatest architectural achievements in history. The Laurentian Library, designed by Michelangelo for Medici manuscripts, pioneered architectural innovations that influenced building design for centuries. The Boboli Gardens behind the Pitti Palace established a model for formal garden design that spread across Europe. The Medici invented, or at least perfected, the role of cultural patron as we understand it today. Before them, powerful families supported artists and scholars, but the Medici raised patronage to a systematic practice, using it deliberately to enhance their prestige and shape their legacy. They understood that commissioning great art was not just consumption, buying beautiful objects for personal enjoyment, but investment, creating permanent monuments that would outlast any political arrangement. This insight has been repeated by wealthy families and institutions ever since, from the Rockefellers to modern tech billionaires who fund museums and universities. Their influence on Western intellectual history is equally profound. The revival of Platonic philosophy that Cosimo the Elder sponsored, through Marsilio Ficino and the Platonic Academy, helped shape Renaissance humanism and, through it, modern Western thought. The scientific patronage of the 17th century contributed to the emergence of experimental method that underlies all modern science. The academies and institutions the Medici founded or inspired established patterns for organizing intellectual work that persist today. Even small things bear the Medici imprint. The italic typeface in which many books are printed was developed by Aldus Manutius, whose work was supported by Medici networks. The conventions of opera, which emerged in Florence around 1600, were developed under Medici patronage and at Medici courts. The formal garden style that spread from Florence across Europe shaped landscapes from Versailles to Hampton Court. The Medici are woven into the fabric of Western culture in ways that most people never notice, precisely because their contributions have become so fundamental that they seem natural rather than invented. And what of Florence itself? The city that the Medici made famous remains one of the world's great cultural destinations, visited by millions every year who come to see the Renaissance masterpieces that the family collected and commissioned. Tourism is now the city's primary industry, and that tourism exists largely because of the Medici legacy. The family that once grew rich through banking has made their city rich through art, a transformation they could never have anticipated, but one that perfectly captures the long-term value of cultural investment. Walk through Florence today and you are walking through Medici history. The Duomo with its Brunelleschi dome, funded by the guild that the Medici dominated. San Lorenzo, the family church, with its Michelangelo-designed library and mausoleum. The Palazzo Medici, now a government building, where Cosimo the Elder received visitors and quietly controlled the Republic. The Uffizi, originally government offices, now housing the art collection that Anna Maria Luisa preserved for posterity. The Ponte Vecchio, where Medici employed goldsmiths once worked and still work today. Everywhere you turn, the Medici name appears, on buildings, in museums, on plaques commemorating this or that family achievement. It's tempting to view this legacy with uncomplicated admiration, but that would miss the moral complexity of the Medici story. They were not saints. They were ambitious, often ruthless people who pursued power with determination and did not always care about the methods required to obtain it. They manipulated elections, bankrupted rivals, and were complicit in atrocities like the Saint. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. Their wealth came from a banking system that exploited loopholes in religious law and extracted profits from people with few alternatives. Their rise displaced other families who might have governed Florence just as well or better. The art they commissioned often served propaganda purposes, glorifying the family and obscuring the less attractive aspects of their rule. The patronage that seemed so generous was also a tool of control, binding artists and scholars to Medici interests and directing their talents toward family goals. Even the Patto di Famiglia, that generous final act, could be seen as an assertion of Medici ownership over Florentine culture, a claim that the art belonged to the family and only through their grace would it remain in the city. But acknowledging these complexities doesn't diminish the achievement. The Medici were human beings, with all the flaws and contradictions that implies. They operated in a world that rewarded the kind of ambition they displayed, and they played by the rules of their time while occasionally transcending them. The art and ideas they sponsored exist regardless of the motives behind their creation. The beauty of Botticelli's paintings is not diminished by the fact that the Medici paid for them, any more than a building's usefulness is diminished by knowing that the construction workers were paid wages. What the Medici ultimately prove is that legacy is a choice. Every powerful family accumulates wealth and influence. Most of them dissipate those advantages within a few generations, leaving behind nothing but genealogical records. The Medici chose to convert their wealth into something permanent, into buildings and artworks and institutions that would outlast any fortune. They built for eternity, even when they didn't realize that's what they were doing. And eternity, or something close to it, is what they achieved. From village healers in Cafaggiolo to Grand Dukes of Tuscany, from struggling merchants to papal princes, from local bankers to the blood relatives of European royalty, the Medici trajectory remains one of the most remarkable in Western history. They rose further and lasted longer than almost any comparable family, and they left behind treasures that enrich human civilization to this day. Their story is one of ambition, intelligence, ruthlessness, and occasional nobility, a thoroughly human story, which is perhaps why it continues to fascinate us 5 centuries after its peak. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider what the Medici teach us about the nature of power and its uses. Power can be deployed for many purposes: personal enrichment, political domination, family aggrandizement. The Medici did all of these things, but they also used their power to support genius, to preserve knowledge, and to create beauty. The balance sheet of their legacy includes massacres and masterpieces, corruption and culture, self-interest and genuine contribution. Like all of us, they were mixtures of good and bad, operating within the constraints and opportunities of their time. The last Medici, Anna Maria Luisa, understood something profound when she signed the Patto di Famiglia. She understood that her family's political power was finished, but their cultural legacy could endure forever if someone made the conscious choice to preserve it. She made that choice, and because of her, millions of people every year can experience the beauty that her ancestors collected and commissioned. The dynasty ended, but the legacy lives on. The Medici began as healers, and in a way they ended as healers too, preserving and sharing the cultural achievements that heal the soul and elevate the spirit. Their name lives on, not in ruling princes, but in the galleries and libraries and churches of Florence, in the scientific institutions that trace their lineage to the Academy of Experiments, in the very idea that wealthy individuals and families can and should support the creation and preservation of knowledge and beauty. Florence still stands, still beautiful, still drawing visitors from around the world who come to see what the Medici built and collected. The Arno still flows past the Ponte Vecchio. Brunelleschi's dome still rises above the red rooftops. And somewhere in the Uffizi, Botticelli's Venus still emerges from her shell, forever young, forever beautiful, forever Florentine. Good night and sweet dreams. May your sleep be as peaceful as a Renaissance garden, and may you wake to a world still enriched by those who, centuries ago, understood that beauty and knowledge are worth preserving, whatever the cost. The Medici are gone, but what they built remains, a gift from the past to every generation that follows, including yours,